Well, so much for this being a short episode. I got all over the place here. Welcome to the Intrusions in Depth podcast. I'm Josh Stepp. In this episode, I wanted to spend some time talking about Iran, specifically how they conduct cyber attacks, the players in the game, and sort of their motivations. I find that if you understand the geopolitics of what's going on, the objectives and the goals of the state, back groups, a lot of this makes more sense. My goal here is to tie it all together and loop it into the June 2025 attack, Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Hammer, if you go by the military naming for them. I'm going to do my best to explain both sides, as balanced as I can, which is usually a recipe for people claiming I'm biased towards one way or another. Of course, this is with the caveat from the perspective of a Western, non-Muslim Team USA dude. Admittedly, as a prior and proud U.S. airman, I got no love for radical jihadists or people who celebrate the Beirut bombing of 1983 or the Khobar Tower bombings, or anyone that really wishes ill will against the United States military, or I guess the United States in general. Let's just be clear right off the bat. I'm far from supporting radicals or really having sympathy for them either. However, like I said earlier, to discuss some of the motivations of Iran, specifically the current regime, we have to look at the history. Nothing crazy, like 80 years or so. But I need to lay some groundwork here, as most people can barely find these countries on a map, let alone understand their history and some of their culture or traditions. My ask through all of this is to try and imagine this through the eyes of someone living it. Strategic empathy. There's a common trend that I see today, and maybe it's been around my entire life, but I see it more and more, especially in the last decade, of people reducing other people or ideas, well, anything really, down to like a slogan or a catchphrase, a caricature. The more I see, the more it disgusts me. One of the awesome things about being an adult is that your brain is developed and you're now allowed to think for yourself. You don't need to offload that to someone else. Even if you are an adult, you don't have to buy into the snippets and slogans. But what becomes abundantly clear is that most people, especially those in positions of power, world leaders, they usually aren't James Bond level villains, despite the newspapers and social media accounts saying so. Sure, there could be religious zealots, dictators, propagandists, etc. But there's some motivation behind what they do, why they do it. And in Iran's case, it's complex. Contrary to popular belief, the Iranians didn't wake up one morning, show up on the front step of the White House asking for like soil and water, and then get kicked in a hole by Jimmy Carter or someone to start all of this. And that's not why they hate the United States and Israel. And I'm sorry, that's a terrible 300 reference. But we're just getting started here, and there's probably going to be a lot more. But it probably has something to do with the 1953 election that's widely believed to be influenced by the CIA. Now, this was before election interference and threats to democracy was bad. As the Church Commission kind of pointed out later on, there was quite a bit of questionable behavior going on by the United States government this time. And as a result, the Western-friendly Shah, also known as a king, if you were curious, was put into power. And the nation of Iran went through a bit of a transformation where it looked a lot less like a conservative Muslim nation and instead more like London or the United States at the time. I'm not a fan of monarchs. I think they all kind of suck. Maybe that's just the American part in me coming out, but I think George Washington and his homies had a right idea when it came to stacking bodies to escape all that. But lots of conservative Muslims in rural Iran didn't like the Shah either. Mostly, this was around how close the Shah was with the West, or how oppressive the Shah was towards religions. Also, it didn't help that the Vietnam War was ending and the American defense contractors needed another source of money. So Jimmy Carter and the United States government, allegedly, pressured the Iranian government to purchase their iconic F-4s. Now, this is an expensive purchase for a nation that had a lot of people struggling. And it turns out people expect the government to be for the people of the government and not the source of support for other countries that don't pay taxes or support that government. It's a wild concept, I know. Then there's also the Shah had cancer and was seen as weak. He traveled away for treatment And when he was around, he was seen at cocktail parties and events, cozying up to the West, and not so much taking care of his country. And as we've seen through history, eventually this gets old, and a coalition of people willing to do something about it emerges. And this is when the 1979 coup, or the revolution, took place. Then, the next year, in 1980, the awful Iranian-Iraq war kicks off. Now, this war was freaking awful, very similar to like World War I and how they fought. Nasty trench warfare, chemical weapons, people dying and having to be buried in trenches and running out of space to bury people in the trenches, and just having to watch your friends and fellow soldiers just sitting there, rotting as you're continuing to fight. It was truly a terrible war. And then to add salt to the wounds, the United States starts backing Iraq in that war. Well, fast forward a little bit, and then Iran starts their nuclear project, Project Ahmad. Then there's the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. More recently, there's the famous 12-Day War. Sorry, that's a silly name. And for context, I don't think any of that's over, but I guess I'm going to go into this a little bit more later, but the 12-Day War Cliff Notes version is that during negotiations between Iran and the United States on a new nuclear deal to limit enrichment, among other things, Israel launched a preemptive strike on some of the nuclear facilities within Iran. Like I said, I'm going to go a little deeper on this in a later segment, but the Israelis didn't have the capabilities, as in the ordnance or the planes, to attack Iran's most hardened site, Fordo. It's deep in a mountain, or was deep in a mountain, depending on how you feel about battle damage assessments. But these strikes also included targeted assassinations of military leaders, government officials, and key nuclear personnel. And there was also some telephone-based PSYOP warfare and attacks on the banking system. More specifically, a bank. It's not reported that there was multiple bank hits. Now, Iran weathered the storm. They regrouped and launched their own retaliation. Now, this was mainly a large number of drones and missiles being fired at Israeli targets. The Israeli air defenses showed signs of being overwhelmed, and as a result, some of those Iranian ordnance found their target in Tel Aviv and throughout Israel. Days later, the United States gets involved, which many believe is at the request of the Israelis. And in the most covert military mission that was ever conducted, the United States sent B-2 bombers armed with GBU-57s, massive ordnance penetrators, to strike Fordo and other nuclear sites. Now, this was covered in almost real time by every media company and with anyone with a camera, that seems, and anyone capable of really tracking ADSB with the YouTube channel, although not all of that was being squawked or broadcast. Now, Iran, in the second most covert mission to ever take place in the history of the world, retaliated by notifying the United States of their impending attack and launching a ceremonial attack of 14 missiles at unmanned, largely dormant targets in Qatar. They really showed that asphalt. Now, this saved face by them retaliating, but it didn't cause any real damage to American interest and didn't cause injury to any American service members in the area. Thank God. A few days later, Israel and Iran agreed to a ceasefire. Israel was sort of caught pressing the limits of that ceasefire, and this led to President Trump melting people's minds because he said the F word on TV and was condoning Israel at the time.
Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I've never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because of one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
Now, fun fact, President Clinton had a similar take in 1996. And I'll read an excerpt from an article in Slate from 2012. Quote, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has never worried much what foreign dignitaries thought of him. Barack Obama was certainly not the first American president to find him a tough customer. In 1996, Bill Clinton remarked privately after his first meeting with Bibi, who the does he think he is? Who's the superpower here? End quote. And on a gee whiz note, if you're looking for a decline in journalism over the past decade, click on that link and read it, and then click on the Slate button in the top left corner of the website and see what the headlines are that's populating the main page now. To be fair, this 2012 article was written by Howard Easonsat, a professor of history. Maybe that had something to do with it. Fast forward to today, and the ceasefire appears to be holding, although it does look fragile. And then, of course, there's many people that believe this is all follow-on actions after the October 7th attack by Hamas, in which 1,200 Israelis lost their lives, and there was hostages that were also kidnapped. And, of course, there's still the stuff going on with the Hezbollah attacks that took out a lot of their leadership that I document in the PSYOP series, and the attacks on the Houthis that have been factors in all of this as well. And that's probably a good enough summary for what we need right now. And like I said, I'm going to dig deeper into this as we go. But first, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
As I work my way to the threat actors, let's spend a few moments discussing some of the demographics and facts on Iran. I need to build some knowledge here so I can expand on it. So for starters, Iran sprawls across 636,400 square miles of strategically vital territory. For reference, this is a landmass almost twice the size of Texas, and it's hosting roughly 92 million people. Now, this is the Persian civilization, and a critical landmass that sits at the crossroads of Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. Bordered by 7 nations and commanding critical access to both the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea. Now, going way back in time, this civilization, has seen many conquests from Alexander the Great, the Macedonians, in roughly 330 BC, the Islamic Caliphate, and the various dynasties in the 600s CE, followed by the Turks, the Mongols, and more recently, the 16th and 18th century, parts of Persia, or modern-day Iran, being under control of the Ottoman Empire. But this is limited and rather minor. For all intents and purposes, it's been a while since Iran has successfully been invaded and conquered. So I personally think it's nuts when people claim that doing so will be a cakewalk. It's big, there's a highly competent population, the terrain's awful, and it's highly defensible. The sheer amount of blood and treasure that would be expended to invade and occupy such a large area, a large population, is difficult to comprehend. On top of that, what do you do when you occupy it? 20 years in Afghanistan worked out so great, and there's not a lot of evidence that shows the benefits of doing so either. Now, some estimates claim it would take 500,000 boots-on-the-ground personnel to occupy this area. That's not counting what it would take to get a foothold to begin with. I mean, at this point, you're talking about a coalition of NATO or multiple countries at a minimum. And the elephant in the room, you have to hope that Russia, China, North Korea, as well as the other militias and groups, they don't get involved either, which feels unlikely. Now, getting back to the demographics. Iran is a Muslim nation. Shia Muslims account for approximately 90 to 95% of Iran's population. Now, this is the 12er school of Shia Islam, and it's the official state religion, and Iran's government operates under Islamic law, or Sharia law, as interpreted by its clerical leadership. And this is where Iran stands out in the Muslim world, as it's primarily Shia. Now, on a quick note, I'm going to use the term Shia to describe this branch of Islam, but it's also called Shiite as well. It's how it translates to Arabic. I had a friend back in the day explain to me that in Arabic, Shiite doesn't exist, and Shia translates to follower. I don't know how true that is or how accurate it is. So I guess I probably should have looked that up before spouting it on a podcast. But because of this preference from him, and as a respect thing, and that Shiite kind of sounds like the word, well, I think we know what that is. I don't want to mispronounce it as I'm prone to do. So I'm going to be using Shia to describe this branch of Islam going forward. And that's not to say other groups aren't present in Iran. Sunni Muslims do inhabit regions within the country, but as a minority representing maybe 5 to 10%, depending on the source. Now, most of this is in the form of the Kurds, which are Sunni, or Turkmen, in areas like Kurdistan. And I talk more about the Kurds in one of my Phineas Fisher episodes. I'll link through to that if you want to know more. Then the surprising part for most people is that there's a small group of other religions within the country. Armenians and Assyrians make up most of the Christian population. These groups also have reserved seats in the Iranian parliament, but it's so small that their presence there is mostly ceremonial. Now, additionally, they can practice their religion within designated churches, and they can maintain their own schools and cultural institutions, though these are heavily monitored by the government. Now, next is the real shocker for most people. There's Jewish people in Iran, mostly focused in Tehran. According to Wikipedia, quote, in the 2016 Iranian census, the remaining Jewish population of Iran was 9,826. As of 2021, only about 8,500 Jews still live in Iran. After Israel, it's home to the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East, end quote. That's Wikipedia, so there's known to be some bias in there, but ultimately speaking, this kind of dampens the whole extreme views or hatred on the religion alone, which I'm sure exists in some form or another. I don't want to paint a picture of like rainbows and unicorns here. By Western standards, things definitely aren't equal or fair, especially if you aren't a Muslim man. Even then, I still think it probably sucks compared to the freedoms of living here in the West. Despite being in a theocracy, other groups are allowed, sometimes I guess, to practice and gather in some form that is recognized by the government, which is a detail that gets lost when stock footage of B-roll is aired with the leaders and crowds chanting death to Israel and death to the United States. And great, now that I'm probably on some list, and this episode is probably shadow banned on YouTube. Oh, and once again, I think those slogans are really stupid. They suck, and I don't think it's some kind of joke. The reality of the situation, or really any situation in geopolitics, is that it's a mixture of things that start a conflict. Nation-state beef is serious. We don't live in a time where militaries or each party go out to a field and fight it out amongst themselves, or where only the men wearing the flag of a nation are the people targeted. Going to war in modernity means civilians, women, children, the elderly, in addition to the men and women fighting under the flag, are going to die. Now, inserting my own opinion again, as this is my podcast, I'm far from being any sort of pacifist. I firmly believe there's reasons to assert violence over another party if the situation calls for it, i.e. the Revolutionary War. I'm kind of glad George Washington and his friends got in a boat. They traversed an icy water in the middle of winter and started imposing their beliefs on people and what they thought America should have been at the time. But on the inverse of that, if history, at least recent history, has taught us anything, going to war without a clear outcome, in mind, leads to kind of a huge waste of resources, money, and people. There's been countless examples of this. It kind of happens every time someone tries to attack Afghanistan. Now, in Iran, as of current times, Iran has a strong working age population. The elderly only make up 8% of the population, while the youth make up somewhere around a quarter. The other 2/3 are the working age. But like the rest of the developing world, they're facing a population replacement issue. Now, these numbers were a little squishy in my research, but generally speaking, Iran's replacement rate is somewhere around 1.7. And this is below the 2.1 minimum that is generally agreed upon. Now, there's another metric called population pyramid used to describe where each portion of the population size is represented by levels of the pyramid. Ideally, you want more youth at the bottom and proportionally elderly and working group going up. Iran's age pyramid is described as stationary, with a declining birth rate and relatively low death rate. Well, like I said, this is typical of development countries. The base is narrowing due to lower fertility, while the working age population remains dormant. So instead of a pyramid, it starts to look a lot like a square. By 2040, 2050, Iran could be facing situations like other nations where they don't have enough resources to fight militarily or maintain their economy because the population is too old to do so. And there's a strong argument not to engage in such because you don't want to wipe out the age bracket while also wiping out parents for the next generation. If everyone starts fighting with drones and Tesla Optimus bots, that throws a new variable in the situation, but we aren't there yet. And we could discuss this more, but this isn't the focus of this podcast. I want to lay some of the information down so the rest of the episode makes sense. Now let's discuss some of the strategic considerations of Iran's placement in the world. This podcast takes time and effort to research, produce, edit, and publish. Many of you reached out on how you can support it. Well, first of all, I'm honored and genuinely shocked by the generosity. But second, to do so, there are really two ways, I guess. You can be a paid subscriber. Right now, I release everything I make for free. But in the future, there may be a perk there. I'm open to suggestions. Oh, and please don't contribute or sign up if you can't financially afford it. I would rather you go out on a coffee date with someone, take your kids out to ice cream, or even give that money away to like a local food bank before signing up to be a premium member here. I know it's kind of anti-marketing here, but the limiting factor of me getting out episodes is my time. It's not money. Additionally, or alternatively, you can promote this podcast on your platforms. LinkedIn, X, social media, your friends. I don't run ads and would rather use my time to make the podcast instead of promote it. Maybe that's a mistake, but I'm driven more to create a great final product than to make paid social media ads. So if you get value out of this, please like and subscribe and do the other social media things I talked about earlier. And I think I've had enough rambling here, so let's get back to the episode. As I finish laying the foundation here, and since this is 2025 and the Overton window of what's considered anti-Semitic is constantly moving, I want to do a preemptive strike on the idiots that flood my inbox whenever I discuss this conflict. This topic is wrought with landmines, and sadly, I doubt this done anything to stop the incoming flood, but we'll see what happens. Now, I'm using the term Zionist as someone who supports the modern political movement of Zionism, which advocates for the self-determination and statehood of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. Now, you're free to think of that as you want, but this isn't meant to be derogatory as an insult to anyone. When it boils down to the basics, I consider myself a Zionist. I'm not someone who's militant about it. I don't have a ton of skin in the game, to be honest. I like Jewish people. I like plenty of Israelis. I've worked with the IDF forces, and I think they're awesome. I think it's awesome that there's a technologically developed nation that works hard and will accept anyone who's Jewish as a way to protect them. So if you're listening to this and somehow get to the conclusion that I'm being anti any group of people, you're flat out wrong. Iran is in a select group called the Axis of Evil, which has a weird origin story, at least to me. President Bush, W., dubbed Iran, Iraq, and North Korea the Axis of Evil in the 2002 State of the Union address. This was right after 9/11, and the United States as a whole was actually unified, and the Congress didn't act like a bunch of camera-seeking, attention-starved babies during the ceremonial speech. I watched this in research for this episode, and I still don't understand how North Korea got lumped in here. It feels like one of the speechwriters was like, this goes pretty hard on the Middle East. Let's toss in a non-Middle Eastern country too. Man, I really hope that didn't happen. Nowadays, Russia and China sometimes get thrown into the Axis of Evil too. I'd be surprised if BRICS didn't get tossed in there in the near term. Iran's inclusion was tied to its support for Shia-backed groups like Hezbollah, we're getting there, and its nuclear ambitions, and its opposition to U.S. interests in the Middle East. I really needed to get that in there since I was talking about Bush.
Iraq is reconstituting its nuclear weapons program. Saddam Hussein has held numerous meetings with Iraqi nuclear scientists, a group he calls his nuclear mujahideen, his nuclear holy warriors.
Now, speaking of Hezbollah, Iran has positioned themselves with like-minded groups, forming an axis of resistance. I think that's trademark. Through supporting proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, Iran is built like a Shia crescent in the Middle East. It also gives them plausible deniability in conducting terrorism not under their own flag. Now, plausible is doing a lot of work in that statement, because everyone kind of knows the game at this point. Iranian officials getting wounded from carrying pagers sold to Hezbollah fighters from Israelis' Mossad kind of confirms that. But that's just the most recent example. It's a known thing at this point. That's what I'm trying to convey here. Now, since October of 2023, post-October 7th attack on Israel, in which Hamas fighters killed 1,200 people and took hostages, some of which still haven't been released at the time of this recording, Israeli military and intelligence units have been hammering these proxies. In Gaza, there's been massive bombing campaigns and destruction. Pivoting to Hezbollah, Israel assassinated leader Hassan Nasrallah in September 2024 via airstrikes in Beirut, along with the walkie-talkie and pager campaign I hinted at earlier. Like I said, I have an entire episode on that. It's gotten the most hate to date, so maybe it sucks, but I'll link through to it just in case you want to see it. The Houthis in Yemen have proven to be a little more difficult. Yemen itself is in a proxy war of sorts with Iran and the Saudis. There's been a civil war going on in Yemen in which the Saudis have been involved via airstrikes, naval blockades, and ground operations with the goal of restoring control to the internationally recognized Yemeni government. The United States has also been involved in this as well on the side of the Saudis. Now, the Houthis have been engaging in attacks on shipping vessels, disrupting international trade. The United States have attempted bombing the Houthis in an attempt to curb these hostilities with mixed results. I think even after the latest hits on Iran's nuclear facilities by the United States and Israel, the Houthis have threatened to resume cargo attacks. But I think that they're only distinguishing between those tied to Israel at the time. It's hard to keep track of all the different threats from these groups. What is alarming, though, is the support for these groups doesn't appear to be fading. It's actually quite the opposite. There's growing concern from these airstrikes as terms like, "I guess we're all Houthis now," circulate on Telegram channels. As many people suspected, bombing a group of people only radicalizes followers and strengthens their support. The fear here is that aggressive actions from airstrikes are causing a circling the flag effect, which there's evidence to support this happens almost every time a foreign nation attacks. My opinion is that this goes down to like the tribal wiring of people in general. You tend not to worry about internal conflicts with the tribe when another tribe is threatening your existence or your resources. For most Americans, think about how unified the nation was post 9/11. And this isn't to say, hey, just stop bombing them and maybe they'll be nice. There's arguments to be made that this isn't an American problem at all. Well, besides the death to America chance and the possibility of sleeper cells like October 7th attacks on United States soil. But that's an entire new conversation, and I don't really want to get into it here. Instead, let's lay a little context on why strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities took place. The starting point for this event goes back decades, and I'm going to be overly simplistic here, as this could be an entire series of episodes, and to be honest, you'd be much better served getting them from someone who has actually explored it more. With that being said, most people agree the Iran nuclear starting point was in the 1950s in the Atoms for Peace program sponsored by the United States and some other nations. The idea was that the United States and other countries would support a peaceful nuclear program, share technology and knowledge in exchange for not building nuclear weapons. And for the record, I like these post-war soft power projections. I'd like to see them come back, but in the current state of government purchasing and contracting, it would probably just be another grift for people to swindle the government out of taxpayer funds. So I guess that's depressing. The problem with this program is that it was a little loose. Everyone saw nuclear energy as the answer to this clean energy and earth-changing technology, which in some ways it was, but some nations saw it as a way to level up their presence in the world, usually as a reaction to nearby neighbors getting the same capabilities. India is perhaps the core reason the program died, and future programs didn't come to light. I'll explain that. So India joins the Peace for Atoms program, and the United States provides heavy water and resources, while Canada provides the CIRUS reactor. The CIRUS reactor, which stands for Canada-India Reactor Utility Services, and it lacked IAEA safeguards that prohibit it from being dual use, or capable of making weapons. Canada wasn't secretly trying to help India get a nuclear weapon. It was just an early iteration of a nuclear reactor, and no one assumed that India would go the route of getting nuclear weapons. India, outside the rules of the program, repurposed the spent fuel rods into weapons-grade plutonium. This weaponization was driven by China achieving nuclear weapons, as India had just lost the Sino-Indian War with China in 1962. The two share a border. Now, this war was a little over a month long, and these two countries routinely have flare-ups along country lines. China likes to redraw maps based on perceived historical land. The problem is that those maps stay in China, and China expects its neighbors to respect their newly drawn lines. Kind of like if your neighbor built a new fence in front of their old fence every 5 years, and then took down the old fence behind it. A slow territorial game that looks benign, but eventually you have a fence right next to your house and you're probably pretty mad. Now, you can see the stick fights and stuff that happens on the borders floating around social media when it does happen. It's kind of funny to think that modern armies are fighting this way, but people die, so that's sad. But I think you get my drift. Just kind of 2025 and people still hitting each other with sticks and army outfits. Kind of weird. India in 1974 conducts their first nuclear test, or as I guess I should call it what they called it. It was a quote-unquote peaceful nuclear explosion of a weapon dubbed Smiling Buddha. Now, Pakistan, who shares a border with India, saw this test, and they had just lost the Indo-Pakistani War, which Bangladesh became independent, and determined it would be a good idea for them to have a bomb too. Prime Minister Ali Bhutto even went as far as to declare, quote, "If India builds the bomb, we will eat grass or leaves, even go hungry, but we will get one of our own," end quote. Which, although it's more colorful, resembles the sentiment the MBS had when asked what Saudi Arabia would do if Iran achieved nuclear weapons. Then, this wouldn't be a story about nuclear weapons if I didn't introduce A.Q. Khan, a metallurgist who worked in the Netherlands. At his tenure there, though, he stole centrifuge designs and supplier contracts, then went on to create his own black market of nuclear material. Now, Khan's black market network also supplied technology to Iran, Libya, and North Korea. You see, I'm getting there. China stepped in to provide reactor support against the wishes of the international community, which I guess doesn't really surprise anyone. And in 1998, Pakistan conducted multiple nuclear tests, cementing themselves as the newest nuclear power. Now, going to Iran's path and how they're currently at the situation they're at today, this includes the 1979 revolution. Initially, the new Ayatollah deemed nuclear in general un-Islamic and removed Iran from the Atoms for Peace program. However, shortly after being attacked by chemical weapons and the involvement of world power proxies in the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, they restarted their nuclear program under the name the Ahmad Project. In the 1980s and 1990s, Iran received uranium enrichment technology, including centrifuges, from A.Q. Khan's network. Russia agreed to complete the Beshor reactor in 1995. And China provided uranium exploration and facility blueprints, though U.S. pressure ultimately blocked China from supplying reactors and enrichment plants. Now, the Beshor reactor was in some ways the ideal scenario for nonproliferation. It was light water, meaning it used normal H2O or normal water for cooling, and it uses plutonium, but is contaminated with the less ideal isotope, and the fuel rods were sent off to Russia for processing. Iran also lacked the ability domestically to pull the plutonium from the spent rods. But the issue was that those reactors couldn't meet the power needs of Iran. Or Iran is lying and they needed the ability to be able to make weapons. I'm not trying to paint Iran as being honest and trustworthy actors here. Now, light water reactors are the global standard for nuclear power, accounting for almost 90% of civilian reactors. So many argue that if Iran would have continued to go down the light water reactor path, then proliferation concerns would not have occurred. Now, there's points to be made of the debate here. I'll do my best to explain both sides. Iran claims something along the lines of the United States and Israel were so determined to stop any nuclear power program in Iran that they weren't able to get the reactor to meet the needs due to sanctions. Now, Israel and the United States would claim that Iran had always wanted to pursue weapons, and this was a threat to Israel and had to be stopped. Pretty much the same argument we just heard 50 years later in 2025. Either way, Iran got a nuclear reactor. They claimed it was for research. It was called the Arak reactor, since that's where it was located, or the IR-40, as it's officially known in the JCPOA. Now, it has a dual use ability and could, in theory, produce weapons-grade plutonium. Iran lacks the processing power to do that, though. By all accounts, this reactor has been under redesign as outlined in the JCPOA requirements as well. And there's also the subject of Israeli sabotage efforts and attacks on it. Currently, the core, though, is being redesigned and it's in construction. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking about plutonium when the point of contention appears to be around uranium. Well, my astute listeners, nuclear weapons need either plutonium or uranium as its nuclear material. Weapons grade at that. Highly enriched with P-239, plutonium, or U-235, uranium. Those are the radioactive isotopes. I'll explain this in a minute. Now, let's describe the American attack, specifically Operation Midnight Hammer, and how it unfolded. On June 22, 2025, 7 B-2 bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, and they headed east with multiple in-flight refueling sessions so they could reach Iran without landing. Now, this was pretty impressive as the strike group traveled 18 hours with no communication and radio silence the entire way. Now, when they arrived in Iranian airspace, they met up with fighter escorts and pushed towards their targets. At the same time, a nuclear submarine off the coast of Iran launched 24 Tomahawk missiles at the nuclear site Isfahan. While the missiles were airborne en route to their target, the B-2s dropped 12 bunker buster bombs on Fordow enrichment site and 2 more at the Natanz enrichment site. All 125 aircraft involved in the attack were able to remove themselves from Iranian airspace without any losses. Now let's talk about those sites being bombed and how to use uranium to build a nuclear weapon. Well, first you have to harvest uranium mine, in which Iran has 2. The issue is that most of the uranium that exists in nature naturally is U-238, but for a nuclear bomb, you need the lighter version 235. So the second step is the metal needs to be converted into a gas so it can be purified. Now this is called uranium hexafluoride. There's only one publicly known site that could do this, and this was Isfahan. The idea is that attacking here establishes a bottleneck in their enrichment pipeline. Now, the third step comes from the enrichment of the gas, which is done using high-speed centrifuges. As the centrifuges spin, the heavier U-238 moves to the outside, while the 235 moves to the inside. Now, this allows the gas to be enriched up to the magical 90% threshold that most consider weapons grade. Now, these centrifuges are a pain to stop in an emergency, and they're highly sensitive to vibration. So they probably aren't a big fan of being bombed. Now, the 2 known enrichment sites are Fordow and Natanz. Fordow being the harder of the 2 with newer equipment, allegedly. The fourth part of the process is called metallization, where you turn the gas into metal, or build the bomb's explosive core. Now, the sole facility known to be capable of doing this was Isfahan, which was hammered, and thus the capability was likely degraded or destroyed. Now, this presents another bottleneck in that pipeline. So even if you were able to continue enrichment to 90%, they still can't build a bomb without being able to do this step. It's also worth pointing out that Iran has other known metallization plants in the past, and those could be restarted, or maybe there's even secret ones. The last part that most agree that Iran is missing is the delivery system component, specifically the miniaturization detonator device, so it could be on a warhead. Now, some sources do report Iran having this capability, but it's a little fuzzy. The Israelis did attack the Sanjarian site, which was believed to be the place where they were building this technology. So maybe some intel made it worth striking there to present yet another bottleneck. I think it's safe to assume that their capabilities have been severely degraded due to damage to key sites. But you need to account for the 14 scientists being assassinated as well. That's another huge bottleneck, a bottleneck that puts Iran in a tough spot. Over the last 2 years or so, their proxies have been getting hammered, as well as the Assad regime falling. So this could present Iran to feel like they are vulnerable, perhaps being the next Iraq or Syria or Libya. They have been reluctant to negotiate because the President of the United States could change, and thus something like the JCPOA-2 could be revoked at a whim, and they have no leverage in that agreement. And the terms under the Trump administration doesn't appear to be favorable as those under the Obama administration when the JCPOA was crafted. And there's also the North Korean precedent, in which it shows that no one really messes with you if you race toward a nuclear proliferation. Say what you want about that strategy, but there's evidence that it works. Now, as I pivot to the threat actors focused in Iran, I want to start broad and niche down. I went back and forth on how to organize these groups, and I settled on who they were attributed to. And I took the most liberal interpretations of that as well. Now, generally speaking, Iranian-based threat actors have 3 categories of operation: intel collection, destructive activities, and more recently, information and operations. Which, to most, probably sounds like pretty much everything that occurs in cyber operations, especially when you sprinkle in deploying ransomware as suspected moonlighting occurs. Some would argue that as sanctions continue to do their thing, this could change. I personally think sanctions have little effect, and climate change coupled with corrupt management of the country will likely do it faster. especially if they kind of run out of water, which appears to be happening. There's also some more rare supply side and crypto exchange attacks as well. So it's really a full spectrum of capabilities being deployed here amongst the various groups. Among world cyber threat actors, Iran is generally seen as less sophisticated compared to like China, Russia, North Korea, the United States, Israel, some European agencies like the British or the Dutch. The Australians are looped in there as well. This doesn't mean they're any less effective. It just means that the technical capabilities needed for their operations isn't always as complex. Now, they do have some highly technical units that have a strong grasp of like Microsoft Azure cloud environments, but it doesn't appear that they have the capabilities to build something like Stuxnet just yet. It doesn't mean they aren't effective though, but as you'll hear, it does lead to some rather embarrassing OPSEC fails. Personas being used both on public forums and malware development makes the indictments and sanctions much easier to justify. This takes operational maturity too. Now, using code names and call signs and having the discipline, or I guess the legal actions to not do so, or use those monikers outside of clear environments is something that really doesn't appear to be a grasp yet. Now, breaking these categories down further, intel collection comes in both flavors. The massive collection of PII and targeted attacking of individuals or organizations based on the needs of the regime or the Iranian government. Now, these are dissidents, activists, American defense contractors, journalists. I think you get the gist. Now, destructive operations comes down to basically breaking things, which in this case is primarily done via like wiper malware that destroys things in the file system like master boot records. Those attacks are usually focused on critical infrastructure as well, so that's always great. The last category are those information operations, sort of propaganda campaigns. Now, it's a newer vector and the goals aren't always as fleshed out in my opinion. And sometimes it's to interfere with elections, which I have serious doubts on the effectiveness of. And some of it is a means to initial entry, gathering the first foothold into a network. This is where I think using those techniques gives the most value. There's also like the hack and leak operations that fall into this, stealing sensitive information from Israeli dating apps and releasing all that information for everyone in the world. Now, as to who is conducting these operations, most of the groups are attributed to either the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, a Ministry of Intelligence and Security. There's some hacktivist groups with fuzzy attribution as well, but we'll sort that out. Now, touching on these organizations a bit, at a high level, the IRGC is a military and political institution in Iran. It was established after the 1979 Islamic Revolution to protect the regime and advance its ideological goals. It could be thought of like a modern-day equivalent of the Praetorian Guard from like the ancient Roman days. It operates independent of Iran's regular military and reports directly to the supreme leader. The sole purpose of the group is to preserve the revolution itself. The IRGC oversees internal security, controls strategic vectors, energy, telecommunications, and projects Iranian influence abroad through proxies. These are Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and sometimes militias in Africa. They are heavily involved in offensive cyber operations focused mostly on espionage, sabotage, and influence campaigns for the most part. Their cyber activities often align with geopolitical goals such as disrupting rivals or retaliating against sanctions. They are carried out by specific units within the organization. Most fall under the IRGC CEC, the Cyber Command, although some of the APTs in this episode are tied to other units, which you'll hear about. Although there are separate units or commands, there are often signs of tool overlap. To be fair, there's often shared resources between the second group as well, the MOIS, which I guess is actually a good segue. A Ministry of Intelligence and Security. This organization is Iran's primary intelligence agency responsible for domestic and foreign intelligence operations. It focuses on countering internal dissent and gathering external intelligence. Unlike the IRGC, the MOIS reports to the president of Iran, who I guess in some ways reports to the Ayatollah. In basic terms, the MOIS monitors dissidents, conducts espionage abroad, and suppresses opposition within Iran. It operates covertly, as you would expect most spy agencies to do, often through front companies. That's why if you read Department of Justice reports or State Department sanctions, it often calls out these organizations. Using front companies is a favorite of spy agencies. Every spy agency does this for the most part. Now, this brings up an oddity of sorts that should be considered, though. The MIOS, under the leadership of Ismail Khatib, directs several networks of cyber threat actors, much like Iran's use of proxies for terror. It looks like this is a strategy in cyberspace as well. If it's not broke, don't fix it, I guess. Now, these groups are considered subordinate elements of the ministry or are explicitly designated as being owned or controlled by it. This sometimes leads to competition between the organizations. And this institutional competition can lead to for a fragmented apparatus that is less professionalized than state-controlled cyber armies in other nations. Furthermore, this reliance on non-state actors and contractors who may be motivated by profit rather than ideology can sometimes introduce vulnerabilities and OPSEC failures. Okay, I think this is enough of a preamble. Let's start with some of the IRGC affiliated groups. The first threat actor intrusion set that I'm going to highlight is APT42, which is one of the newest to be classified as an APT. As a note, I'm going to be mostly using Mandiant's naming for these groups as well. It feels more familiar to me, and I've always been a fan of Mandiant's naming structures. On that note, I'll provide some other names of the groups as well, or where activity clusters have naming overlaps. I'm going to be the most generous here, as not everyone agrees on how to segment some of these clusters. APT42 is believed to be an Iranian state-sponsored cyber espionage group active since at least 2015. Now, this group is most likely backed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence organization, the IRGC-IO. The main focuses here are on stealing information and conducting surveillance, often targeting sensitive individuals and organizations. The bulk of the group's targets are in the Middle East, which isn't out of the norm for IRGC-backed groups. Where things get novel is when we start talking about who they target. Most IRGC-backed groups are targeting defense contractors or doing large-scale PII harvesting. The IRGC is in charge of certain industrial sectors, so those are typically the sectors being targeted by the group for espionage. This includes civil society and nonprofits. These are mostly Western think tanks, education, governments, or government officials, Western government officials that are hostile to Iran, or even former Iranians, healthcare, mostly around the COVID era, legal and professional services, manufacturing, media and entertainment, pundits, personalities that are critical of Iran. Well, I guess I should maybe rethink this episode. And lastly, pharmaceuticals. Again, this was around the COVID era. According to Mandiant, APT42 has targeted organizations in at least 14 countries, including Australia, Europe, United Kingdom, Middle East, Israel, and the United States. Now, this is government officials, former Iranian policymakers, the diaspora, opposition groups, journalists, and academics. Some of the other names that this group goes under includes UNC 788, Mandiant, and this was before they were upgraded, TA 453, Proofpoint, and ITG 18 from IBM. And then there's the sort of maybes. Charming Kitten from CrowdStrike, Phosphorus from Microsoft, and UNC 2448 from Mandiant. Now, these are sort of maybes in that APT42 and APT35 have overlapping cluster activity. And this is where things get messy in CTI, clustering overall. It also highlights why it's so difficult to sanction these activities in the West. This quote from Google Mandiant's APT42 report illustrates this. Quote, APT42 generally corresponds with the activity other organizations have referred to as TA 453, Proofpoint, and ITG 18 from IBM. This group is also consistent with the subsection of publicly reported threat clusters, Phosphorus from Microsoft and Charming Kitten. Similarly, in malicious cyber operations between various Iranian groups and a dynamic institutional ecosystem in Iran contributed to a significant conflation of historical APT42 and APT35 activity, end quote. Now, APT35, which is the next threat actor I'm going to discuss, and APT42 are both IRGC-backed, but likely have different mandates, different contracts or contractors. Now, some of these differences are historical APT35 operations were long-term resource-intensive and against large sectors. APT42 appears to be more agile and able to ship operationally more. An example of this is during the COVID dark ages, where they switched up their targeting to pharma and medical. Additionally, APT42 operations are more narrowly focused on individuals and specific organizations that align with interests from the Iranian government. interests that could include domestic politics, foreign policy, and ensuring the stability of the regime in power. These are kind of like core IRGC roles. There's also shared tooling between the groups. Magic Drop, which is a lightweight dropper that decrypts files stored within its PE structure, and Broken Yoke, which is a .NET downloader. But one thing that did stick out to me was that there's no common C2 infrastructure between the two. So they likely have the source code for both of these samples, as the C2 is typically hard-coded into them. So let's go on a small tangent to discuss other messy aspects of clustering, the ransomware activities and likely moonlighting. Reporting from Microsoft shows overlap between a group they tracked in 2021 as Phosphorus, which would be Mint Sandstorm, Microsoft's weather lexicon that they use today, and APT42, as well as UNC2448, another Mandiant UNC. Now, UNC2448 is an Iranian-based group, but as of this report and podcast, they haven't been upgraded to a FIN or an APT group or something like that. This wasn't in the report, and it is generally my opinion, but since Iran likes to use contractors and maybe sometimes college students to supplement this work, it's highly likely that they reuse some of these skills, infrastructure, etc., as a sort of moonlighting, making money on the side, since not everyone pays their spooks six-figure salaries. As I brought up earlier, this is a sign of operational immaturity. There's numerous reports from individual organizations, media companies, and the US government on this occurrence of moonlighting and ransomwaring. I'll include some from CISA in the show notes. In this case, the reporting was mostly focused on scanning for Exchange servers and exploits in the Fortinet VPNs. It's worth highlighting, though, that once these Exchange server exploits were dropped, literally everyone who does ransomware on boxes was trying to exploit these machines, and Fortinet devices being popped in the wild should really just be like a feature that they offer these days. Now let's pivot to how 42 does their operations. Cyber espionage is carried out through credential harvesting, impersonating people to build trust, and mostly like long-term operations, which is a telltale sign of these being state-backed and well-resourced. They have demonstrated the ability to bypass MFA, either through phishing or through like elaborate uses of fake web pages. There's reports of the group conducting surveillance on persons of interest of the regime as well, usually those involved with the Green Movement. Now, this group has also demonstrated use of mobile malware to exfiltrate phone call records, room audio recordings, images, and entire SMS inboxes. On one of these targets, these interactions were almost daily. Lastly, there was some malware development seen from the group. Nothing extraordinary for the most part. It's usually the creation of lightweight payloads for initial footholds or some minimal beacon/commands on the host. Attribution determinations from Google Mandiants are pretty strong, indicating that the group is Iranian-based based on the year of the attacks that align with the goals of the Iranian government. Essentially, when the regime announces a new strategic goal, there's an uptick in activity around those matching TTPs that cluster for that group. The IRGC and the Ministry of Intelligence and Security have the mandate to conduct cyber espionage operations, while both orgs have jurisdiction to target domestically and foreign. Now, some of the groups highlighted in this episode have some rather unique or novel ways of conducting their operations. This group, however, isn't that exciting in that aspect. They gain entry primarily through spear phishing. They utilize long, drawn-out, multi-day engagements. They use some lightweight custom payloads for their first foothold, and then gain persistence via registry keys or like startup task. Where things get interesting is when they also register their devices for MFA support. They register their own Microsoft Authenticator apps. Now that's risky in some cases because you burn the phone for detection purposes, or you could just use it for your next set of targets. On the other side of that, though, it highlights a shift in tactics in the post-pass world we are all transitioning to. Now, this telemetry is still difficult to track and capture data on. In my opinion, only really mature orgs or those burned by phones in the past really come through the authenticator data. It's difficult to know if someone got a new phone or if it's an attacker. Lapsus and like the APT teams of today have kind of highlighted this abuse and trust and how effective social engineering is in abusing it. All right, while APT42 information is relatively scarce as it's a newer group, APT35 on the other hand has a much longer history and documented trail. Let's discuss that now. APT35, or more fittingly, clustering that maps to APT35, is considered one of the most prolific Iranian-based groups since they got their operations off the ground in 2014. And this group has been involved with the majority of the Iranian-based attacks on the United States, the ones that get publicized or indicted. I'm getting there. Now, some other names for this group includes Phosphorus or Mint Sandstorm, Microsoft's naming strategy, both old and new, newscaster team from iSight or Newsbeef from Kaspersky. How they got that name is pretty awesome. In the podcasting business, that's called foreshadowing. And of course, there's the more disarming name, Charming Kitten, which is CrowdStrike's name for the group. Most researchers, intel people, they believe the APT-35 emerged from an existing Iranian keyboard commando unit, perhaps taking the best like APT-33 members and forming a new unit under a different command or so. Obviously, it's impossible to know without some inside knowledge of the IRGC operations, and I'm not part of Mossad or the CIA or the NSA or any group that would know that, so I guess we're left with speculating and navel-gazing. This hypothesis, though, is formed by skills and expertise that the group possesses when they were first discovered. And like APT-42 that we just discussed, their goals seem to align closely with IRGC's stated goals. Early targeting was on Middle Eastern countries and Asia, and then they pivoted to the United States and Israel along the way. Speaking of that, this brings us to the attribution discussion. APT-35 is believed to be two groups clustered under the same umbrella. Specifically within the IRGC, they are believed to be part of the Electronic Warfare and Cyber Defense Organization, the EWCD, a group that's been sanctioned by the US since 2018. Now, the first subclustering is known publicly as Imperial Kitten. That's using CrowdStrike's name. Like most Iranian threat actors, they fish their victims and utilize watering hole attacks to gain a foothold in the network. From there, they pivot to the information gathering phase and operations needed to get to that stage. It usually looks something like harvesting credentials, logging into an email account, using a recovery account to get on websites with juicy information, and then they profit. On a technical level, there's nothing really interesting, to be honest, but it doesn't have to be flashy, it just has to work. As of more recently, they have been targeting shipping logistics, maritime security, and government organizations. You might say that's a clue. What groups of people in Yemen have been targeting ships and have connections to Iran? I think we can put the pieces together there. The second cluster is more interesting as far as I'm concerned, as they are more technologically adept, and this is tortoiseshell. Now, they usually stick to social engineering to get their initial foothold, but where this group stands out is their use of Azure cloud infrastructure to blend in and masquerade with legitimate services names. Cloud is hard for defenders. IP addresses rotate, subdomains can look weird, and there's processes communicating out that haven't been around long enough for them to be widely documented. Plus, this is Microsoft, and well, Microsoft does things weird. If you aren't a PowerShell expert and you don't spend a lot of time in their docs, the way they do things isn't all that intuitive, especially if you're coming from like an AWS or GCP background, and no one reads Microsoft docs after all. Now, sectors targeted are mostly related to aviation, defense, and they cluster to the Middle East, Israel, of course, and even Albania, allegedly. Usually looking to mess with the IT or compromise supply chains, which is a bit of a novelty, as this is one of the few supply chain attacks that they've went after. And Albania is a bit of an odd target as well. Most people that follow this stuff would likely have heard some of their more recent activities with the backdoor mini bike or mini bus. I'm trying to keep this episode digestible, so like always, I'll link to reports for all that in the show notes. If you want a future episode on the adventures of APT-35, maybe I'll put that in the queue or something. But with that, I'm going to go through a more in-depth list of their attacks through the years in a moment, but I wanted to jump to a specific one as I think it highlights the creativity of this group. After the attack on Israel by Hamas on October 7th, a group was formed called Bring Them Home Now. Now, the purpose of this movement was to organize and support the returning of hostages taken by terrorists. Now, most would agree this is an obvious reaction. Well, this group set up a fake website with an application on it so that people could sign up to support the movement or even join it if they were affected by the attack. Now, for example, they've had a loved one taken as a hostage or something. Now, that's pretty diabolical. In other words, vulnerable people searching for answers or support. They had just suffered a very traumatic event that's pretty foreign to most people in the modern civilized world. The people who did sign up for this application on the fake website were backdoored using Minibus. Anyone that signed up now had the threat actor on their device. This was obviously very beneficial in targeting of Israeli organizations and Israeli people, as that attack affected many people. But people from all over the world had loved ones affected. So this operation put backdoors on people worldwide. They really capitalized on this heinous event. Not to derail the conversation, but this is what I think modern cyber warfare looks like, especially paired with kinetic events. Now, earlier versions of this group, known as APT-35, specialized in website defacement. Now, this was over a decade ago, and obviously the group has matured since then. FireEye published a report called Operation Sapphire Rose that discusses some of this and attributes the activity involved in a username and a type of pattern of life analysis for the entity based on public information. OPSEC has come a long way, people. In 2014, the group was believed to be responsible for defacing a presidential website in Iran as a way to sway the election. Seems redundant when you have a monopoly of violence and can probably cook the election at will, but I guess they wanted to appear legitimately. In 2014, an American Air Force member named Monica Witt defected to Iran. I'll circle back to this in a minute, but it makes sense to lay a stake here for when this occurred, as this is a time frame when an uptick in attacks on US-based military members and contractors occurred, at least the social engineering portion. Now, Operation Saffron Rose was when Iran or threat actors cluster to APT-35 specifically penetrated a Navy intranet system. Now, the caveat being that not all intranets are the same, but if you're the DoD, you pretty much don't want any adversaries in your network, unless it's like the MSS posing as Microsoft support in China. That's a joke, people. The Department of Defense, Department of War, has been very vocal about correcting that, so I doubt no other companies probably ever do that. Now, back to the Navy breach, one could suppose it helps if you have a TS-SCI defector assisting. Although Monica Witt wasn't a cyber person, she was intel. I got more thoughts on this in a minute, but let me close some of the other threads here first. In 2015, or as some reports suggest, late 2014, the group adopted another strategy that earned them the name Newscaster Team. Now, in an eyesight report, they documented how these Iranian threat actors were impersonating journalists to target activists and academics critical of Iran. Now, this tactic went on for a while, and it's still used periodically, allegedly. They often impersonate reporters from major news networks like CNN, Reuters, or the Wall Street Journal to trick their targets into providing login credentials. This could be from our fake web pages that harvest credentials, malicious documents. They even use fake interview requests or other social engineering tactics to gain access to their victims' accounts. Now, this is primarily focused on academics and activists, but there has been incidents of officials and military personnel, particularly in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, to gather strategic information. In 2017, an APT-35 adjacent person was charged by the United States in connection to a ransomware and extortion attempt on HBO. The attack on HBO in May of 2017 was an extortion scheme that was kind of novel at the time. Instead of using typical ransomware that locks files, the hackers stole a massive amount of data, threatened to leak it publicly unless HBO paid a ransom. Now, the stolen data included about 1.5 terabytes of information, such as scripts for unaired episodes of Game of Thrones, full episodes of other shows like Ballers and Curb Your Enthusiasm, confidential company records, and sensitive contact information for cast and crew. Now, they wanted $6 million in Bitcoin, as this was their 6 months of salary, according to them. And for the record, I think that was a lie. If you're making $1 million a month, shaking down HBO over scripts to a later session of Game of Thrones and Ballers, it's got to be a negative ROI. Now, the U.S. Department of Justice charged Bizat Mizrahi, I know I botched that name, an Iranian national, for his role in the attack. Now, the indictment stated that Mizrahi had a history of working for the Iranian military and was a member of the hacking group Turk Black Hat security team. Now, this group was known for defacing hundreds of websites and conducting cyber attacks. Now, the researchers then went on to establish a link between Turk Black Hat security team and Charming Kitten, APT-35. Now, this connection was made through a third individual, another member of the Turk Black Hat group with the online handle Aryan Iran. Now, this individual was found to have registered the domains and provided infrastructure that was also used by APT-35, shared network and collaboration between the two groups. Now, while the HBO hack was financially motivated crime, which is atypical for a state-sponsored attacker like APT-35, Mizrahi's known history and the technical links found by the researchers strongly tie him to the attack and the broader Iranian cyber war apparatus. This also helps us build a mental model for Iranian cyber operations. It suggests that non-state groups and state groups work together. Perhaps there's like contractors of sorts that they utilize for infrastructure. Perhaps part of the deal includes moonlighting as a ransomware operator. Something like, give me the C2 domains and the infrastructure, and once we steal all the information off the network, you can ransomware it for a ransom. Now, this does a lot of things. It can distract from other operations taking place, it can cover some tracks, and it can take the spotlight off the state-backed group. Now, on the other side of the coin, this could be used to map infrastructure and make ties like this. You're at the mercy of the OPSEC procedures of this third party. But it's not like the IRGC is going to extradite this dude or anything. So as long as he doesn't take a vacation in Thailand, or like the Mossad Batman doesn't kidnap him in the middle of the night, it's likely he'll never see an American prison. Then in 2019, the Southern District of New York indicted this guy again, this time along with Monica Witt and 3 other Iranian keyboard commandos. They were accused of targeting former colleagues of Monica Witt. Specifically, it was conspiracy and attempted computer intrusions and aggravated identity theft. Once again, though, it's not entirely clear how Mesrai is connected with this group. I think John Hillquist, the chief analyst of Google Threat Intelligence, and before that, FireEye and like the Cyber Warcom founder, put it best in an article with foreignpolicy.com. Quote, these guys are probably contractors or not necessarily uniformed officers who probably have other side projects going on. It really makes it difficult to tell what their relationship is with the government. But while headlines of a defector being indicted grabs headlines, along with the names of 4 Iranian hackers that no one had heard of, Microsoft's digital crime unit seized 99 websites and directed them to a sinkhole. Now, this eliminated multiple watering hole operations carried out by the group. Once Microsoft started looking deeper into the operations of the group, they found more disturbing evidence. According to Stamus Networks, quote, they discovered 2,700 attempts to gain information regarding targeted email accounts, which in turn led to 241 attacks and 4 compromised accounts. Microsoft determined that the attacks were aimed at the 2020 United States presidential election. Iranian officials denied any involvement in the election tampering. However, the Microsoft and other third-party security firms maintained the belief that Iran, more specifically APT-35, were directly behind the attempted interference due to the undeniable similarities in tactics, techniques, and procedures between the election tampering tactics and other previous Charlie Kitten attacks, end quote. Into the current day, this group has continued to carry out attacks throughout the world. I wanted to highlight some of the bigger events from the past here, but now I wanted to do a quick pivot into Monica Witt. I don't want to glorify a traitor or defector, especially one that's wore the same stripes and chevrons I did, but I think it's important to share a story. It's a case study and radicalization of sorts. This keeps working, so I'm going to try it again. I've recently helped on a few projects, some fiction books and a nonfiction book, that I can talk more about in the future, as well as consulted on a curriculum for a section on cyber adversaries for a college. The collaboration's been great, and it's something I want to do more of, once I know about what you have in mind, though. So to facilitate this, I have a section on my website, IntrusionsInDepth.com, where you can fill out a form and I'll get in touch. Let me know what you have in mind. Now, let's get back to the show. In doing the research for this episode, Monica Witt's name popped up as the targeter, specifically building target packages for the Iranians on American targets. Now, to the untrained person, that might not mean much, but to anyone that's been in Intel or worked with Intel, this can be a bit of an art form. It definitely represents a sign of maturity in the Intel space. If you want an idea of what this looks like, I recommend people check out the Bin Laden documentary on Netflix. That gives you an idea of the knowledge that these individuals gather on potential targets to build these packages. And this can be a thankless, draining job. You're essentially researching everything about someone that you plan to kill or potentially kill. To make matters worse, you rarely build packages on people that speak English, so you rely on the help of linguists. And that's what Monica Witt was in the Air Force. For Iran, it's believed that she has taken on the role of being the targeter, as she would have likely been exposed to that entire pipeline of building intel when she was in the DoD. But being a linguist sounds awesome until you have to actually learn the language and the speed in which the military wants you to learn it. So you have to suffer at DLI in Monterey, California for months and get a crash course in a language that most people fail out of. And I know some people may be chuckling with, like, how do you suffer in Monterey, California? Well, if you want to pass this pipeline, you have very little time for being outside or even time for social events. You're usually heads down learning a new language. And Monica Witt learned Farsi, and as a result, she got closer to the religion and Iranian culture in doing so. However, she also started to show signs of being radicalized through this journey of becoming an Iranian citizen. Now, her growing interest in Islam and the Middle East was evident in her master's degree capstone at George Washington University. While she was there, she became aligned with an individual named Mezrai Hashemi. He was/is suspected to be an Iranian intelligence officer. Now, this could be a clue. Then, there was also allegations of Witt providing Iran with classified information from her U.S. military service, with Hashemi's help. Now, this could also be interpreted as a clue. Now, fellow students and faculty at GWU described Witt as being reserved but vocal about her distress over alleged U.S. military actions, including drone strikes and extrajudicial killings, which she claimed caused her insomnia. She spoke of feeling isolated and conflicted about her identity. More clues. Now, in February 2012, Witt attended the International Conference of Hollywoodism in Iran, organized by the IRGC-linked group New Horizons organization, which promoted anti-American and anti-Semitic narratives. There, she appeared on Iranian television identifying as a U.S. military veteran and criticized the U.S. government. Despite FBI warnings in 2012 that she was a target of Iranian intelligence, Witt assured authorities that she would not share sensitive information. However, she soon worked with Hashemi on an anti-American propaganda film that aired in Iran. Then, between June 2012 and August 2013, Witt communicated with Hashemi, discussing leaked intelligence and defecting to Russia. She was referencing how Edward Snowden did it with WikiLeaks. In February 2013, at another Hollywoodism conference in Tehran, Witt expressed regret over alleged war crimes from her Air Force service and participated in more anti-American videos. In July of 2013, Witt searched for former counterintelligence colleagues on Facebook, targeting sensitive contacts. On August 25, 2013, she emailed Hashemi her military credentials, a conversion narrative, and her DD Form 214. And Hashemi forwarded that to an Iranian contact. I guess even Iran wants to see your DD 214 before they hire you. And 3 days later, Witt boarded a flight from Dubai to Tehran, defecting to Iran. Her last contact with U.S. friends was in summer of 2013, when she was teaching English in Afghanistan. After months of silence, the FBI listed her as being a missing person, noting her prior travel to the UAE and Iran, before her indictment was unsealed. Now, on the plus side, she's no longer missing, but most people knew she was most likely working with the IRGC, helping them conduct operations against adversaries of Iran in some fashion. Now, I think this gets memory hold as modern war atrocities are blasted across social media feeds, but the adoption of drone technology and drone assassinations were messy. As the drone programs came online during the President Bush and President Obama administrations and the capability was being tuned, there was a desensitization period for the world to understand this facet of warfare. Now, if you're an adult around this time, you likely remember the news features on shows like 60 Minutes, where they show drone operators talking about their trauma from the operations that they carried out. I think there was a movie or something on this made as well. Quick edit from editing, Josh. The movie was called Good Kill. Back to the show. And due to some factors that had not been iterated on at the time, the early drone operations could be described as barbaric. There's a lot that could be said about how the early drone strikes contributed to the insurgency math, as General McChrystal called it. But the overall gist here is that it's probably not a stretch for most people to see how Monica Witt got to this point. Now, I don't support the decision, and I'm not saying you should either, but you can see how it happened. As we all saw during the COVID times, people feeling isolated and alone is brutal on the psyche. It's not good for people. Now, couple that isolation with the guilt and trauma of seeing people die, people you heavily researched, or even the trauma of seeing kids get hurt or killed. It's a lot to ask for someone to stay in the fight in that. Now, this was a pivotal sort of event that expanded on Iran's capabilities in this space. But now I want to discuss the importance of Stuxnet and how it shaped Iran's cyber strategy. It's kind of a big deal. I think this goes without saying, but Stuxnet wasn't a new chapter in cyber warfare. It was a new book. So much so that between books, other content creators, and every college course remotely tied to cybersecurity has already covered this topic to death. I've gotten asked to do an episode on Stuxnet a few times as well, and I don't believe I have anything new to add to the conversation. Chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you have a good idea of what Stuxnet is. But just in case you haven't, I'll summarize it, so you can get the gist of what I'm saying. Stuxnet is, or was, a highly sophisticated computer worm discovered in 2010. It's widely believed to have been developed by the United States and Israel as a cyber weapon.
Allegedly.
It was designed to target and disrupt Iran's nuclear facilities, specifically its uranium enrichment facilities. If you remember from earlier, you need centrifuges for the uranium enrichment part of the weaponization process and enrichment process of getting U-235 uranium. Now, more so, it targeted the Siemens industrial control units, the software and the PLCs, the programmable logic controllers. It injected code into the components and caused them to spin radically and break themselves, thus slowing Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities. This was probably super frustrating, and who knows how many scientists were executed for their incompetence when it was really just these devices. That's pretty dark to think about, actually. Additionally, Stuxnet utilized 4 zero-day exploits in Windows. They didn't crash cars or make the world go nuts, calling on Robert De Niro, but they did allow the code to be moved around air-gapped environments undetected, spreading to most of Iran's enrichment fleet of centrifuges. The Iranians thought their scientists were messing up because all the components were reporting nominal, despite self-terminating themselves and messing up the enrichment. This incident also brought the equities discussion to the forefront. Now, if you believe the folklore, this was the United States using zero-day found in products made in the United States by a United States company, in this case, Microsoft. There's a discussion to be made there about equities, and this discussion has popped up numerous times as well. Now, most people are familiar with the exploits used in NotPetya and WannaCry, exploits released by shadow brokers and alias believed to be the Russian state-backed actors after they stole it from the NSA. Anyway, I think that's enough background for Stuxnet. There's plenty of books and YouTube videos on the subject if you want to read more. I'll link through to some of my favorites. Like I said, this has been beaten to death, and I don't really have much to add here. But the 2010 Stuxnet attack on Iran's nuclear facilities served as both a wake-up call and an inspiration, demonstrating Iran's vulnerability and the potential of cyber weapons. Stuxnet was an embarrassment to the regime. No government around the world wants to be seen as an embarrassment, going through great lengths to save face. However, when you're a despot authoritarian regime, looking incompetent or weak has added risk. The population you're oppressing, or the groups thinking about staging a coup or regime change, well, they can be emboldened. And this regime has a pretty good idea of what regime change looks like. 1979 isn't all that long ago. And you don't want people asking, why should I follow this idiot that can't even launch a warship correctly? Sorry, that's a North Korean joke. But even fast forwarding to the 12-Day War, sorry, I have a hard time chuckling when I say that. But even in this conflict, once the United States got involved and dropped the massive ordnance penetrators on the facility, Iran needed to save face, doing so in a largely symbolic airstrike on the Qatar base with tons of warning, ensuring no Americans were hurt and there was no any threat of danger to them. Now, on social media, there was plenty of photos circulating of downed B-2s. They were all AI generated. The people around them were like the size of ants. Apparently, the IRGC thinks that B-2s are like the size of the Death Star. However, Stuxnet did inspire the Iranian threat actors to learn how to attack critical infrastructure. Like many other nations and threat actors, they saw the destructive power of successful campaigns. In many ways, Stuxnet accelerated Iran's targeting of ICS or OT networks, industrial control systems, which is a good transition to Shamoon. The regime also saw the news coverage that generated the ceremonial validation that can be used to bolster the reputation of the regime, while also acting as a form of information operation, PSYOP. Every once in a while, an attack occurs that gives us all a glimpse of what cyber war could really look like. Shamoon was one of those events. Now, just to clarify, I'm talking about Shamoon 1. There's also Shamoon 2 and Shamoon 3, which are attributed to APT-33, and some reporting has APT-34 involvement as well. I personally believe the cutting sword of justice, I'm getting there, it's just a precursor for the early front of what we now call APT-33, which is an IRGC group, which is why I'm talking about them in this section. Now, this is with the usual caveat that attribution in cyber operations is probabilistic and based on indirect evidence most of the time, rather than definitive proof. So you need to reason to get to this determination with mental models and tools to hopefully remove as much bias and emotion as you can. And this entire Shamoon saga deserves its own episode. I've linked through to the Darknet Diaries episode, and I highly recommend that you check it out. It does a good job explaining the impact and what it's like to be in the middle of it. With all that being said, though, let's summarize this attack and explain how it ties back into Iran. Now, the first attack occurred in August of 2012 against the state-owned company Saudi Aramco. This was an oil company in Saudi Arabia. This was the month of Ramadan in 2012. Now, Ramadan isn't determined off the Gregorian calendar like most of the world uses. It's the 9th month based off the crescent moon and is when the Quran was believed to have been revealed to Muhammad. But during this holy month, Muslim countries are on reduced schedules, skeleton crews. Now, obviously, this is a generalized statement, but I think we all get the point here. It's like the month of December, or more specifically from Christmas to New Year's. It's just a known slow period of time. However, this presented a perfect time to attack the Saudi Aramco Corporation, specifically their computer systems. And Aramco is no small company. It has since IPO'd in 2019, but in 2012, it was widely considered to be one of the top 5 companies in the world. Now, it depends on which metrics you're using, but the point is that it's not some mom and pop operation. It's not some corner mark down the street. Even to this day, with some shares being public, much of the company is still owned by the Saudi Arabian government. Now, this allows the government of Saudi Arabia to control the operations of the organization. Now, the group attributed to this attack called themselves the Cutting Sword of Justice. They posted some paste bins with cryptic messages and threats, but no one really reads or pays attention to paste bin threats, and they weren't seen until well after the attack. Now, the malware was staged with a logic bomb that executed the payload on August 15, 2012 at 11:08 a.m. Saudi time. Now, in a matter of hours, the malware spread across the company's network, wiping the data of an estimated 30,000 to 35,000 workstations. Now, these were computers used for logistics, billing, HR, accounting, and pretty much everything an oil company would need to support selling tons of oil around the world. Now, the pumps and everything, they still moved, but the company wasn't able to sell it effectively, which even prompted them to give it away in some cases, just to keep the world, yes, the world, functioning normal. There's a few ways that we could process the impact of this. First, this is one time in which cyber operations can definitively point to a real-world impact at a global level, or at the very least, a very big regional level. There's arguments to be made about the effectiveness of the attack versus other means. For example, would a kinetic impact shut down operations for longer? Yeah, probably. Would going kinetic speed up the timeline in which the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, most of Europe, and who knows what else goes kinetic on Iran? Yeah, probably that too. So that's probably not ideal. Second, this is an instance in which a country's keyboard commandos, state-backed attackers, target another country's business sector, not their military targeting, per se. Well, sort of. I mean, in times of war, there's certainly justification for oil companies and oil processing to be targets, unless you're fighting aliens that don't use petroleum. It's almost always dual use. Now, Ukraine's current strikes on Russian plants kind of illustrate this. One is to reduce the oil available to the attacking army, and two, it hurts the economic ability of the people, in this case Russia, to prosecute the war. There's arguments to be made if this makes sense to do, but this isn't the time or place to do that. It's merely an example of when this is used, and something that's probably more fresh in most people's mind. Now, in the case of Saudi Aramco, the cyber attack was a hit to Saudi Arabia's economic sector and the world's dependence on Saudi oil. Now, you may be saying, but Josh, Iran and Saudi Arabia, they aren't at war, are they? Well, I guess not officially declared, but that's not really something Middle Eastern countries do. It's more of a European Western construct, in all honesty. And in cyber operations, those lines are blurred anyway. Furthermore, since there isn't really clear doctrine on how you respond to cyber attacks or what the norms of cyber war are, all the parties involved are kind of making up things as they go along. But I digress. I plan to do a Shamoon episode in the future, so I won't go incredibly deep here. But the malware associated with Shamoon consists of kind of 3 main parts. Part 1 was the dropper that installed the malware. Part 2 was the actual destructive malware. In this case, it targeted the master boot record. Now, the MBR, the master boot record, is part of the hard drive that outlines where the other parts of the data are stored. And part 3 was my personal favorite. to a cryptic 16-bit GeoCity styles page with threats and the iconic burning American flag. We got to get back to this era of like HTML. I miss that stuff. Now, when the dust settled, Aramco was able to continue operations after a few months. There were later attacks, but lacked the effectiveness of the original ones. Now, this attack, in theory, put ICS owners on notice about the potential for cyber attacks to their infrastructure. Turns out it doesn't have to hit the OT in order for this to be a huge, impactful event, despite the hype attacks on the OT gets. But rightfully so, though. Those are more impressive, as it does take some serious skills to attack the OT, but it's not the only way. Now, Iran showed their willingness to attack critical infrastructure and how this became a priority for them post-Stuxnet. All right, let's get off this side quest and pivot back to our main journey, APT-33. APT-33 has been around for a while. Their traditional victimology centers on Iran's strategic interests, targeting entities in the United States, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and with some attribution to campaigns within Israel, with a focus on aerospace, military and commercial aviation, energy, petrochemicals, oil refining, government, defense, manufacturing, transportation, industrial control systems, ICS, finance, telecoms, and engineering. Ironically, though, these are all sectors under the IRGC as well. There's some more recent victimology coming out of Booz Allen to suggest they've expanded operations into Belgium, Jordan, and the United Kingdom as well. Now, APT-33 is publicly tracked under the following names: Elfin from Symantec, which I'm the most familiar with, Polium, which is the old Microsoft name, Peach Sandstorm, which is new Microsoft, and Refined Kitten from CrowdStrike. One of the first campaigns carried out by the group was brought to light in 2016 and 2017 by FireEye, or Mandiant. They hit companies headquartered in the United States, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia with a focus on aviation. There was also Saudi and South Korean targets that focused on petrochemical engineering processes that those companies had. All of those attacks utilized a malicious file for the initial payload, usually focused around job vacancies, trying to entice those with access to look at these malicious files. Hey, here's a bunch of money for this job. Now, geopolitically speaking, Iran is most likely targeting Saudi and American aviation because of the partnership between the two countries in which the Saudi royal family buys military equipment from American defense contractors. So for Iran, this lets them potentially steal secrets about American planes while also gathering intelligence on their major rival in the region. Now, the petrochemical portion is because Iran decided it wanted to play in this space after seeing the success of Saudi Arabia in manufacturing petrochemical products. Now, Iran had previously partnered with South Korea on some joint ventures around this time, but those relations had soured pretty drastically by then. Usually, United States sanctions, sponsoring terrorist group, and seizing oil takers, it kind of ruins trust between business partners. Also, South Korea has or had strong business relations with the Saudi petrochemical producers as well. Then, CVE 2017-11774 dropped, and things got interesting. As Mandiant explained in a 2019 post titled, Breaking the Rules, A Tough Outlook for Homepage Attacks, CVE 2017-11774, quote, a client-side Outlook attack that involves modifying victims' Outlook client homepage for code execution and persistence. The Outlook homepage features allow for customization of the default view of any folder in Outlook. This customization can allow for a specific URL to be loaded and displayed whenever a folder is open. This URL is retrieved either HTTP or HTTPS and can reference either an internal or external network location. When Outlook loads the remote URL, it will render the contents using the Windows DLL IE frame.dll, which can allow an attacker to achieve remote code execution that persists through system restarts. End quote. Now, this CVE was a dumpster fire for everyone because the patch from Microsoft could also be unpatched, which frankly speaking isn't desirable. To counter this behavior, a registry key was set to disable roaming to remote pages. But attackers figured out that you could reset the registry key and then YOLO through post-exploitation with the exploit after doing so. One of the more popular methods of doing this was the calendar/URL method. I wrote a lot of detection rules for this. Now, in the sample and writing up Mandiant, they documented how once on the box, the script would fire to ensure that it was on a server through execution guardrails. Then it would unset the registry key and force the settings to enable roaming folder home pages to 1 or true. Now, allowing this to take place, then the setup of calendar URL key to point to an attacker-controlled payload. One thing to call out is that there was a ton of command line obfuscation of these registry keys. And I'll explain that for you as well. Pattern matching off of strings has been around for a while. This is why attackers, threat actors, malwarians, whatever we want to call them, go through great lengths to build paths at runtime or obfuscate crap via like spaghetti variables or variables that look like something a math major would expect. Now on commands, specifically brackets and splitting up the commands with pipes and variables, this is why SIMs can't alert on a command being run sometimes. It's difficult to write a detection rule for all of this, as it's not uncommon for normal commands to have special characters or things being abused there as well. Now, it's still a way to still execute your commands, but not alert when this path is set as a rule. In other words, it's really hard to match on the exact pattern or all the iterations that an attacker could use to obfuscate their command lines when they're running these. And if you get too crazy with like regex or something along those lines, then you're talking about using a ton of resources and potentially slowing down your SIM every time a detection rule is fired. Now, I've written a lot of detection rules for this, and this highlights one of the reasons why having like a dedicated EDR agent is supreme. Now, using like a process command line auditing from the logs, these can all be obfuscated. And in registry events from the kernel, they really can't, or process events as well. Now, these scripts move around, and doing this unpatching was pretty common at this point, and the US Cyber Command and Microsoft begged everyone to patch and harden these systems. Like I said, it was a dumpster fire after all. I'm going to gloss over 2019, but it was another big year for the group. They conducted some password spraying on ICS vendors and spear phishing against Saudi-based chemical companies, and they utilized multiple CVEs against some Middle Eastern and US financial institutions. Now, the CVE used here was in WinRAR. Now, this is the archiver of choice for everyone stealing data on Windows machines. Apparently, there are legitimate uses of this software, and this CVE exploited a piece of code that had been around in the product for like 19 years. This was CVE 2018-2250. So they were basically pwning people with that CVE that was found in 19-year-old code. Now, there's also some sparse reporting on the targeting of the Ukrainian government and a spear phishing campaign in 2019 as well, but there's no clear motive stated, but the UA cert does have some write-ups. Now, going back to detection engineering, whenever you see WinRAR, just assume malice until you're proven wrong. Now, in an effort to keep this episode manageable, we'll fast forward to 2025. In 2025, leading up to the attacks on Iran from Israel and the United States, there was an uptick in activity towards critical infrastructure, specifically in the United States. Now, by some accounts, this doubled over the amount of the intrusions observed. Now, on the surface, that does sound pretty bad. Doubling is never a good thing. In this case is no different. It's not from going from like 1 to 2 or 2 to 4. They had a baseline of 12 and it jumped to 28 by suspected Iranian-based APTs. But this wasn't just APT-33. This could be other groups like Muddy Water or even Cyber Avengers, which I'm going to discuss soon. But now let's talk about some of the APT-33 attribution. As Mandiant, too, doesn't believe in TLP, trust me, bro. Especially old school Mandiant. Just saying, there's any like current Mandiant listeners. Now, old school Mandiant reports just straight up pansies attackers. In a post titled Insights into Iranian Cyber Espionage, APT-33 targets aerospace and energy sectors and has ties to destructive malware. Mandiant researchers tied malware being used by APT-33 to a suspected persona employed by the Iranian government. In the PDB strings of the turned up malware, a known APT-33 backdoor, the path with this handle was found. Xman 1365X. That's the persona. Xman _ 1365 _ X. Now, this Xman persona was also seen on popular Iranian hacktivist forums and was a community manager on a programming forum. This is quoting directly from the piece. Quote, open source reporting links the Xman 1365X actor to the Nassar Institute, which is reported to be the equivalent of Iran's cyber army and controlled by the Iranian government. Separately, additional evidence ties the Nassar Institute to the 2011 through 2013 attacks on the financial industry, a series of denial-of-service attacks dubbed Operation Abibil. In March 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed an indictment that named 2 individuals allegedly hired by the Iranian government to build attack infrastructure and conduct distributed denial-of-service attacks in support of Operation Abibil. While the individuals and the activity described in the indictment are different than what is discussed in this report, it provides some evidence that individuals associated with the Nassar Institute may have ties to the Iranian government. End quote. Now, for listeners without a software background or a malware analysis background, PDB paths are program database paths. They are strings, blocks of text embedded within Windows portable execution, or PE files. These are your EXEs or DLLs. Now, they indicate the file path of the corresponding program database file, the PDB file. And they're generated during compile in times like Microsoft Visual Studio, and they contain the debugging symbols, such as source code line numbers, variable numbers, and function details. So it's kind of aid in troubleshooting these pieces of software. Now, these paths often use fully qualified paths, giving insights into the developer's local environment, or the malware developer's local environment. For example, this could be like their username, or what they name the project file for the malware they're using. Now, Steve Miller was the first person I've seen tracking these. I'll link through to a blog post describing it, but it's pretty old at this point. But they can be great for fingerprinting malware authors or developers. Much like metadata and Microsoft Office docs, sometimes they're spoofed, but it doesn't take much to spin up a virtual machine and copy some well-known PDB paths. Now, most competent malware authors remove these, but sometimes you get lucky. Newer malware authors may be naive enough or just leave these in because they don't understand the attribution aspect of it. But where I get excited is the good old office hours attribution. This was used in fingerprinting APT-33 to the Iranian government, especially since Iran has a relatively rare work week compared to the rest of the world. You see, even state-sponsored spooks and keyboard commandos, they're like normal people, and they don't want to work on the weekends. And in Iran, weekends start on Thursday. Their weekend is Thursday and Friday. So by looking at when the backdoors are active, or the DNS servers are used, or when the command and control infrastructure is active, you can map out their hours of operation. So for example, if the activity follows a pattern, like a set time, 9 to 5 per se, and no weekend work, this is likely a state-backed group. So if it is all hours of the day and there's no set schedule, this is probably an activist or some financially motivated actor. There's other clues as well, like how long the operation goes on or what the objectives on target are as well. There's a ton of variables that you should consider when doing attribution or attributing malice. Now, in Iran's case, like I said, it helps when your work week is different than most of the world. It also helps based on the time zone that you're in. Most of the activity was seen in plus 430 UTC, which ironically puts all of this activity squarely in Iran's daylight time. Now, obviously, sophisticated crews could be doing some false flag operations to paint Iran as the perpetrator of these attacks. But if we apply Occam's razor to our model here, the most likely answer is that it's operators acting on behalf of the Iranian government. Plus, the victimology here, like most targets for these groups, align with Iranian stated goals and IRGC-backed sectors. And this leads us to some of the less well-known groups, probably backed by the IRGC as well. The first one that comes to mind for these lesser-known groups is the Cyber Avengers. This group is borderline schizophrenic, and it's not uncommon for them to pwn PLCs, programmable logic controllers, in a water treatment plant on Monday, deface a website on Wednesday, ransomware another network on Thursday, and then spew propaganda on Friday. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of anyone with a mental health issue, but needless to say, Cyber Avengers is all over the place in what they're trying to actually do. And while attribution is always difficult, it appears that this group has been some sort of proxy for the Iranian regime, giving them a way to target their adversaries while at the same time keeping plausible deniability. So while it may not be the IRGC itself, it is almost surely IRGC-backed. They emerged in a sort of hybrid role as state-sponsored hacktivist group. In a high-profile incident in November of 2023, they attacked the Municipal Water Authority of Aliquippa in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. It's just a crazy name for a Pennsylvania city. Now, on the screens and online, it was explicitly stated that the water plant was targeted because it used equipment made by an Israeli company. Now, according to the CISA alert, the components being targeted in this campaign was Unitronics Vision Series Programmable Logic Controllers, PLCs, and Human Machine Interfaces, the HMI. Now, these were Israeli-made, just if you were wondering. And the defacement message read, quote, "You have been hacked, down with Israel. Every equipment made in Israel is Cyber Avenger's legal target," end quote. Personally speaking, I feel like this is a bit of a stretch to declare this a lawful target. But then again, in 2025, the Geneva Convention definitions of lawful combatants is a floating definition to most governments engaged in wars or even proxy wars. But this municipal water plant wasn't the only target. Quote from the alert from CISA. The victims span multiple U.S. states and foreign countries. These PLCs are commonly used in water and wastewater systems and used in other industries, including but not limited to energy, food, and beverage manufacturing, transportation systems, and healthcare. The PLCs may be rebranded and appear as originating from different manufacturers and companies, end quote. Now, later on down this report, it lists a brewery being attacked as well. I mean, alcohol is haram after all. Further supporting evidence of this is between September 13th, 2023 and October 30th, 2023, the Cyber Avengers Telegram channel displayed both legitimate and false claims of multiple cyber attacks against Israel. Cyber Avengers targeted Israeli PLCs in the water, energy, and shipping and distribution sectors as well. Some being true and some being false and some being true-ish. Technically, they did something, but the outcome was greatly exaggerated. Now, this could probably be interpreted as some sort of terrorism, maybe designated to showcase their capabilities, make people think twice about drinking their water, limiting the trust in their government. Perhaps even a way to show that, hey, if you attack us or if we get in a kinetic conflict, the social fabric of society for you is at risk. In other words, a way to spark chaos. Now, what no one is reporting on, and this is the reason you should listen to this podcast, is that the way that they were getting into these PLCs is really, really dumb. I mean, gong show dumb. They compromised these devices by authenticating to them on port TCP 2256 with a default credential and password, or in some cases, no password at all. In other words, basic TTP, folks. I mean, once on these devices, they removed the ladder logic and replaced it with their own. And their own had no inputs or outputs. And they also didn't burn the logic to the device, so that suggests that they weren't really trying to hide it. Maybe they didn't know that they needed to do that, or maybe they deemed it as not being needed for this operation. Ladder logic programming isn't like C++ or Java or something that you've probably seen, and you can't really get valuable intel from like the function names or the variables. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out how they jacked it up either. The idea of custom ladder logic for each device and other tricks they employed does suggest that they had devices to test on, or at least they were familiar with these devices. Perhaps they had the exact devices, or just since they were open with no auth to the internet, you could just practice a few times too, I guess. They also changed the device names so the operators of the device had a hard time reestablishing connection and remediating the issue. And as an added touch in doing so, they downgraded the PLC software versions, so all the workstations that were on a version ahead, they couldn't connect as well unless they were downgraded to move. Attribution, like most things in this realm, is a bit shaky. Essentially, it was Iranians because people claiming to be Iranians did it to target Israeli companies. I have seen conspiracy claims on the internet saying this was some type of Mossad operation to try and like false flag and stroke hate against the Iranians. But then again, on the internet, everything could probably be attributed to Mossad or blamed on the Israelis, it seems. Going around in this circular logic of speculation is boring and kind of a waste of time, though. Now, in the IOCs of their advisories, CISA also named Crucio ransomware. It's believed that this group is in possession of this ransomware and a capability where they can modify it for their objective. But this requires a little bit of explanation if you look closer at the evidence. Throughout this conflict between Hamas and Israel, or more specifically, the Shia Muslims in Israel, multiple campaigns have been launched by both groups. Influence operations, disruption campaigns, the full gambit. Trying to keep up with all the Telegram channels between this conflict and the ones in Ukraine is exhausting. Especially when you have to Google Translate it all because you barely speak English. Now, some of the campaigns that emerged was known as the Soldiers of Solomon. I'm not saying this is a link behind the name, but in the Bible, Solomon is known as the king of Israel and Judea, succeeding his father, King David, the guy who killed Goliath with a slingshot. Now, Solomon is renowned for his exceptional wisdom, wealth, and the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. He's depicted as the last king of a unified Israel and Judea before the kingdom split. Now, Judea is technically considered the West Bank today, an area Israel has been approving expansion of settlements into. Now, there's some claims about needing to maintain occupation of these areas for security purposes, but I think most people just see them as a reason to expand. Just trying to give both sides of the argument there. I'm sort of surprised Russia really hasn't tried to float that rationale. But anyway, I'm not a biblical scholar, an expert in Israel expansion, or even sure if this is the Solomon the group is talking about. Just figured I should add some context around the name. But the Soldier Solomon group entity persona published on their Telegram channel, quote, "The soldiers of Solomon have taken full control of more than 50 servers, security cameras, and smart city management systems in the Nevin military area. Once we get access to those targets, we exfiltrated 25 terabytes of data and ransomed them via our customized Crucio ransomware." End quote. The proof of this was in the form of screenshots. However, most of the screenshots just displayed a PDF of their demands or a letter to the residents of occupied Palestine. Hence, this is why I included the biblical part of the reference, so it made a little more sense. See, I have a vague outline of what I'm doing here, people. The ransomware they used has been analyzed by a few groups, and most researchers believe that it was leaked source code that they have repurposed, which is pretty common in the scene. Now, the connection between Soldiers of Solomon and the Cyber Avengers is mostly driven by the cyber advisories, and this could just be lazy attribution. But for what it's worth, Microsoft has designated both the Cyber Avengers and the Soldiers of Solomon under their Unified Threat Actor identifier of Storm 0784. So this is why I'm linking them here. Maybe this is what's driving CISA as well. It's all sort of muddy, like muddying the water. This podcast has grown to between 600 and 1,000 downloads between episodes. So if you're listening to this, thank you. However, in order for more people to discover this podcast, I need your help. And this isn't rocket science, and I'm sure you've heard this before. But please take a moment to like, share, subscribe, follow, and all those other things on your podcast player of choice or YouTube if you're listening to it there. It only takes a few moments, and it helps with the discoverability of the podcast. I don't publish often, as it takes time to produce these long-form episodes, so engagement is kind of a big deal. And once again, thank you for your time. It means a lot to me that you've taken the time out of your day to listen to what I have to say. Now back to the show. Now I want to pivot into the MOIS's aligned groups, and first is Muddy Water. And that's the name I feel is most common. Other organizations have called this group, or activity that clusters within this group, Mercury and Mango Sandstorm, Microsoft's naming, Static Kitten, CrowdStrike, Seedworm, which is semantics, Zagros or Temp Zagros, FireEye, and TA450, Proofpoint. Oh, and the name Muddy Water being used as Palo Alto's alias for the group. I guess I should throw that in there. But roughly all of these cover activities seen by this advanced and really aggressive group. Some would argue that it's the most advanced and definitely the most aggressive group from Iran. Being technically sophisticated and highly motivated can make for a long day. And this group has been active since at least 2017, although there's some reporting that suggests it's been active since 2015. Research suggests that Muddy Water is directly affiliated with Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, a state-sponsored entity responsible for intelligence gathering and covert operations. Now, this attribution is supported by multiple sources, including the Council of Foreign Relations, which notes the group's ties to Iranian intelligence, and the U.S. Cyber Command, which linked Muddy Water to the MOIS in 2022. The main way they do this is by looking at the group's operations and how they align with Iran's strategic interests, particularly in countering the perceived adversaries and gathering sensitive information for the regime. Now, there's undoubtedly other indicators as well, but they usually aren't in a hurry to disclose that information, as it could reveal sources and methods and thus burn the operation. Now, Muddy Water's targets, well, they are very opportunistic and prolific. So this is broad. Generally speaking, this is government agencies, including military and defense organizations, telecommunications providers, and IT companies, often for espionage purposes, or a widespread collection of bulk PII. Then lastly, there's research institutes and universities, focusing on those involved in technology and those that have policy, think tanks, and stuff related to Iran. think like think tanks that make policy. Sometimes these are called like policy accelerators. Now, muddy water activity has been observed in those sectors across Israel, the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and sometimes makes its way into European countries. Now, muddy water's core competencies is living off the land. They are like the Bear Grylls of owning people. I know that's kind of corny, but I'm going to go with it. Primarily, they utilize cloud infrastructure from compromised emails and then use legitimate remote agents as their backdoors to steal files and information. Now, that's a move. Catching this requires a bit of visibility and tuning. Now, obviously, having like EDR and robust logging is the best case scenario. As you would imagine, that this would be an outlier amongst most processes. Unless they were using the same remote tools that your org uses, which is also known as a move. Now, on the network, you could be looking for large amounts of data from that host. Hopefully it's in like off hours or something significant like that, so it's easy to spot. But these being legitimate tools and domains though, catching this via an alert for like an IOC or malware signature, it wouldn't really occur. It's a pretty simple and elegant attack strategy, especially if you're only trying to steal data under the radar. The remote management tools are signed, and thus it wouldn't be odd for them to retrieve files. Plus, some of these are hardened, so you can't easily remove them from the box either. Then there's also the telemetry that comes from some of these endpoint agent management processes as well. You can see when someone is on the box, like a normal user, and that could be beneficial in timing your activity as an attacker. Now, in addition to using remote management agents, the group also employs C++ custom backdoors, which is a difference in the usual .NET or PowerShell-based stuff that the other Iranian threat actors tend to deploy. Now, there's multiple versions of their newest C++-based tool, BugSleep, floating around, and each variant usually has like different features baked in. Since it's compiled as a malwarean, you are conflicted in some ways. You would love to have more features in your payload, but then you risk the payload being too big, or calling the wrong monitored API on the system and thus flagging some sort of like ML-based detection, or if they're looking for that with like an EDR client. But if you make it too small, you risk not having all the capabilities you need for the operation. Sure, you can add a feature to deploy in more stages, but that increases the likelihood of detection and the testing window needed to ensure your payloads don't get detected. And time is money is cost. Then, once you are detected, the payload has a signature and thus you need to revamp it, and if you plan on continuing using it. Now, Muddy Water has demonstrated the ability to do this with some level of maturity. And speaking of maturity, Muddy Water also has demonstrated the ability to deploy and use mobile malware. And this is where DCH Spy, custom Android surveillanceware, spyware, malware, comes into the picture. Mobile malware has so many wares. Now, Muddy Water distributes this DCH Spy primarily through spear phishing campaigns, where malicious APK files are hosted on fake websites, or they're delivered straight through email and SMS links that mimic trusted sources. Now, victims are prompted to sideload the app, granting it extensive permissions, accessibility services, storage access, etc. Then it enables its spying functions. Now, DCH Spy specifically has been deployed in targeted espionage since early to mid 2025, ongoing right now at the time of this reporting. And this coincides with the escalation of the Israel-Iran conflict. Now, 4 new samples were discovered just 1 week after this conflict's onset. Now, this indicates that there's rapid adaptation for real-time intelligence gathering innovation. In other words, they're putting a lot of resources into iterating on this quickly. Now, primarily, this tool has been observed to be used against the Israeli government, defense, and private sector entities to monitor communications and movements amidst the ongoing conflict. Now, what does this look like exactly? Well, it includes exfiltrating WhatsApp data from dissidents, journalists, and often officials perceived to be threats to Iranian interests. There's also some shaky reporting on extending to Iranian dissidents abroad and regional rivals in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and global entities opposing the Iranian regime. Now, an obvious target for that would be like government officials within the Trump administration for the United States. Now, these operations aim at long-term surveillance rather than like disruption, supporting the MOIS, tracking opposition figures, and gathering geopolitical intelligence. Now, my personal opinion interjected, I would imagine this to be somewhat true. I mean, if you have this capability, it only makes sense to use it on other targets. For example, I bet the focus on Israeli targets that has been reported is out of the necessity for survival or even withstanding these assaults. But I would also assume that Mossad and the Israeli government has pretty sanitized comms at this point, especially considering the amount of emphasis that they put on making communications hostile for their enemies. Now, historically speaking, while a DCH spy is a newer tool, it fits into Muddy Waters' pattern of mobile espionage, seen in earlier campaigns, 2022. But with the surge in 2025 tied to these heightened tensions, obviously. And there's also the fact that their earlier mobile malware, it wasn't as good. Mobile malware, as I've said before in this podcast, is a tricky place to play. Apple, Google, they're the major players in the world, and they have teams of smart people developing features to lock down phones, ready to analyze crash dumps when something fishy is observed. And as I wrap up this Muddy Water section here, it's worth pointing out that APT-39 and Muddy Water share some overlap, and sometimes they're clustered together. I'm going to talk about APT-39 in a moment. But under different names, obviously. Now, I didn't cluster them together because I believe they are two separate groups. Both use spear phishing and custom backdoors, and there are some overlapping IOCs that use Dropbox C2, command and control, for example. But all these groups have employed spear phishing, and most have used custom backdoors or payloads. But the difference is that Muddy Water emphasizes like broad adaptive TTPs, like those remote management tool abuses or mobile malware, for ongoing operations to target, while APT-39 focuses on like personal information via like travel and telecommunications for dissident tracking, kind of more upstream. Now, Muddy Water's 2024-2025 operations show fast evolution compared to APT-39's more static tools. And this reflects kind of their distinct priorities. In some ways, I think Muddy Water is more like the Navy SEALs or Delta Force of the MOIS, whereas APT-39, which is like the next group I'm going to talk about, is the conventional forces of the intelligence gathering. And I know that's a terrible analogy, since this is a civilian branch of the government, but it was the best I could come up with off the top of my head. And this podcast is already getting long enough. For most people, boarding a plane to go on a business trip, conference, or even a family vacation isn't something that ranks high on their disclosure of personal information, PII. However, you are being checked in, ticketed by the airlines, and by that stages, they have your name, picture, confirmed location for a portion of where you're at for that day, and most likely your address and telephone number. When you're an intelligence agency, that could be useful when building dossiers on enemies of the state. And that brings us up to APT-39, a group widely attributed to the MOIS. That's why they're in this section. Now, it operates through the front company, Rena Intelligence Computing. And this was established in 2014. And this serves as a cover for state-sponsored operations. The U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, sanctioned APT-39 in September of 2020 for conducting malicious cyber activities on behalf of the Iranian regime. And this included targeting U.S. critical infrastructure. And the FBI has also linked this group very recently to previously undisclosed Iranian malware used to monitor dissidents, journalists, and telecommunications firms. Once again, the overarching goal of APT-39, large-scale hoovering of data and collection on people of interest or groups of people of interest for the Iranian government. These aren't like disruption events. They're for strict intelligence. They're after email credentials, PII, information like that. And besides being clustered as APT-39 from Mandiant, this group is often called Remix Kitty from CrowdStrike and the moniker Schaffer or Schaefer. And this is semantics alias, which I'm most familiar with. Now, sometimes this is also grouped with the oil rig, but I personally think that's really lazy attribution, and clustering as oil rig is usually called APT-34, which is a segue in a few minutes. Now, both groups, 34 and 39, often share targeting objectives, infrastructure, and nomenclature for their infrastructure and custom tools or payload. One specific instance of this for a long time was the use of PowerBat, and it was a collection of batch scripts. Now, pivoting to APT-39's more notable attacks, the first of which I want to discuss is the 2020 attacks on Kuwait and Saudi Arabian government and their aviation sectors. Mainly because this is where Bitdefender did a report on in-depth action seen from the group. I'm going to link through to that as well. Now, prior to that, it was mostly FBI advisories and warnings from other governments about the use of custom payloads to target dissidents or widespread collection of information from Middle Eastern targets, specifically in the hospitality sector. Now, I've said this on previous podcasts, but hotel records can be a juicy source of information as it gives you information on where someone is at that specific time, and they can be just as guilty as everyone else in over-collecting information that maybe they don't need. Now, in these attacks on the Kuwait and Saudi targets, one theme that occurred to me was just how simple, especially in today's world, that these post-exploitation actions were. The Kuwaiti incident was considered the more robust of the two, and it was first observed through Base 64 encoded PowerShell commands that used reverse TCP functions. Now, these files were in line with payloads from the free post-exploitation tool, Metasploit. Now, the researchers were unable to pinpoint how they got on the network, but several artifacts indicated it was likely through the use of malicious documents and shellcode. This was likely a phishing attack. Once they got their initial shell in the box, though, they did the usual network scanning, credential gathering, mostly living off the land, but in some cases, they brought their own toys like minicats. From there, they followed the textbook attack chain of moving laterally. As before, sometimes they brought tools with them, and in this case, it was the crowd favorite PS exec. Or they did have a custom payload dubbed One Step, or they just straight up RDP'd into it because YOLO, you can do it. Now, for persistence, they pretty much did everything. Maybe they were playing like MITRE ATT&CK bingo and decided to just max out that tactic. They would create their own user accounts and then proceed to issue a bunch of commands from that account. In some cases, they made persistence a service on the box, and sometimes they just straight up left payloads on the desktop of the compromised machines. That's the old IDGAF strategy. Because of all the payloads and persistence, the attackers kept a near constant communication with the victims. And as a sign of disrespect, I guess, the command and control address for the server, well, it was passed as an argument in every command line argument that the payload issued during its communications. Now, if I was king for a day, this would be one of my decrees. You must include the C2 address in all of your communication with the implant. Obviously, the purpose of this campaign appears to be stealth. No, I'm just kidding. It was smash and grab, stealing large troves of information while not gathering up anything or cleaning up after themselves, and they just kind of left their crap laying all around. Since all these commands were tagged, it's also pretty easy to do a frequency analysis of the attack, and unsurprisingly, it aligns with Iran's work week, and most of the activity was seen on a Saturday. So that would be like, hey, they're coming into work on like a Monday, and they're really going to get things done. And maybe it's because no one else is around. Who knows? Now, the Saudi event of this reporting was kind of lackluster, but highlights an ideal scenario. The attackers got onto the box in a similar vector, believed to be spear phishing, but from there, they did their recon, dropped their tools, and attempted to move. But either because they got stuck or they couldn't compromise any other boxes, they just deemed this target a waste of time, they packed up and left. The attack chain was rather short. Sure, there were a few boxes compromised, and some tools were dropped, but they left and they didn't come back. And there's evidence of them tearing down the C2 server after that operation. So that's a win. Then, in early 2024, APT-39 was suspected to have changed up their operations. Sorta. Part one of the attack was on KuCoin, which is a cryptocurrency exchange. And this part of the attack was largely the same objective as other attacks from APT-39. Theft of PII and credential theft. But then I think someone realized that, hey, we have credentials to a cryptocurrency exchange, and they were probably able to just rob the exchange since they already pwned it. Now, obviously, hitting a cryptocurrency exchange and robbing it isn't something new. I mean, the North Koreans have been doing this for a while now. And even using stolen credentials to commit financial crimes, this isn't novel. Even as I record this episode in September of 2025, Chinese groups are stealing brokerage accounts to pump and dump stocks so they can walk away with these payouts. But this is something new for an Iranian-based group, especially one that's been focused on stealing information in the past for intel purposes. And it's a bit of a disturbing pivot. You have to ask yourself, did they pivot because this was due to sanctions? Is the regime starting to look at other ways of augmenting their government budget? Do they need money for their nuclear program? Or is this just an opportunistic attack in which they had access and they said, hey, we can make more money with very little effort? Now, I lean towards the latter, but it could be a signal for more action to be taken against these exchanges. Not like they need it, I guess. And while these attacks are directly tied to APT-39, there's a series of airline victims that were connected to either a cyber mercenary company contracted out by the MOIS or possibly just another front company for the group APT-39. My personal opinion is that it's a front company. Putting my cards on the table, I bet almost all these company operations could be clustered to APT-39. As I mentioned earlier, the original front company is Reina Intelligence Computing. Now, this new company is called Anbar Sharif Advanced Technologies, and I probably mispronounced that. And earlier this year, gigabytes of internal server data was liberated from this organization, and it shed light on the operations and the individuals involved with the operations. Now, on the surface, this organization called themselves cybersecurity experts. It was founded in 2018 by graduates of the Sharif University. This is like the Iranian MIT. But this breach exposed that the organization was secretly harvesting millions of passengers' personal data for the Iranian intelligence apparatus. Now, they were posing as a legitimate firm, and Anbar targeted dozens of international airlines, such as Turkish Airlines, Royal Jordanian, Rwanda Airlines, Emirates, and Air Arabia, and major U.S. logistics providers like FedEx and UPS. The leaked data revealed attack footages or screen captures from the attackers, and it revealed the systematic theft of sensitive passenger information. And this included passport numbers, flight manifests, and home addresses, all for intelligence gathering purposes. Now, their operations also extended to phishing attacks and attempted insider recruitment at major cryptocurrency exchanges, which may be a byproduct of the Coinbase breach I recently talked about with my friend David Sanchez on the last episode. The breach confirms that direct involvement of government-sanctioned individuals and raises urgent national security questions, especially after it was discovered that one of Anbar's employees recently immigrated to the United States, which begs the question again, who is vetting these people? But the people here is what makes this incident interesting. It's not often that you get the people behind the keyboard or had attribution to that level. Maybe I'm just too curious. But when it does occur, I can't help but dig in. Now, Anbar's CEO is a guy named Benham Amari. And I looked up how to say these names, but there's a good chance I'm still butchering them. He was already flagged by intelligence agencies for APT-39 connections. And Amari hired another individual who was already sanctioned by the United States government in 2020 for attacking critical infrastructure. And this guy's name was Ali Kamali. Just by association, this seems pretty suspect. Maybe there's not a big, vast pool to hire from. But there was also another individual, a frequent visitor, Ahmed Mazahaki, a MOS operative who tended to walk through these offices as if he owned them. Perhaps he was the handler or something for the organization. But the most shocking person here is Arshahari Akhavan, an employee who did work at the company during these periods of activity outlined by the FBI and the Treasury Department. However, Homeland Security, or I guess someone, deemed that this individual was okay to visa into the country. Hopefully they done rounded this guy up by now, but either way, it's a big, big mess. But taking the most harmless view of this, having someone with ties to attacking American businesses and gathering intel on Americans, this should be removal criteria. Or even exercise some due process on them and see if they belong in prison. I'll link through to Nariman Gharib's, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name as well, post on his website where he goes through all of these documents. Oh, and if you want to go deeper into Iran, that's a great place to stop. He has mapped out the command structures of the IRGC and the MOIS, posted pictures of threat actors compiled from online sources, and highlights all the Iranian espionage activity from abroad. And as a bonus, he speaks the language and can translate some of these documents. It was a big help in crafting this episode. APT-34 is the last group for this episode, and since they're in this section, they're also attributed to the MOIS, and they've been active since 2014. Now, it's known for its persistent campaigns involving spear phishing, supply chain compromises, and the deployment of custom malware, which could be said for a majority of these groups that we've talked about in this episode, as you've probably observed by now. Now, the overlap of TTPs and goals make clustering these groups very difficult. Like most threat actors who've been at it for years, over a decade now, APT34 has evolved its tactics over time. It's not uncommon for them to incorporate both public exploits and bespoke tools to maintain access and exfiltrate data. Everyone else is popping 5-year-old CVEs and Cisco bugs or Earth melting exchange bugs, so they might as well get on the action, and especially if there's Metasploit modules for it already out. Now, APT34 operates under multiple monikers, reflecting its tracking by various cybersecurity firms and researchers. Now, some of the most notable ones include Oil Rig, which I think is the most common, and is the name I refer to them, Helix Kitten, which is CrowdStrike's name, Hazel Sandstorm, or Europa, or European. I don't know. That's old Microsoft's name, and Hazel Sandstorm's new Microsoft's name. And once again, each organization might cluster these slightly differently, but I'm taking the most liberal interpretations of the groups for their activities here. APT34's primary objectives center on cyber espionage and intelligence reconnaissance to support the state interest of Iran, aligning with like the government, not the IRGC or the religious side. Now, some of their tactics primarily involve data exfiltration, surveillance, and intellectual property theft, without the destructive elements seen. Now, motivations are tied to geopolitical advantages such as monitoring rivals amid tensions with like Gulf states, the US, and obviously Israel. However, luckily there's an activist group out there that hates Iran too and has released information about APT34's operations on the internet. Enter Lab Dukaton. In March of 2019, the group started releasing information on Telegram. The dump data included the source code of their tools, details of their victims like the usernames and password combinations, information on APT34's operations, including web shells and access details on servers for businesses and governments around the world. In other words, they got pants. Now, to pour salt on the wounds, the group also doxed some of the Iranian government officials involved. In an article by the great Catalin Campano for ZDNet titled Source Code of Iranian Cyber Espionage Tools Leaked on Telegram, I'll link through to it. It's laid out here. Quote, besides data of past operations, the leakers also doxed the Iranian military of intelligence officers, posting phone numbers, images, and names of the officers included with APT34 operations. For some of the officers, Dukaton created PDF files containing their names, roles, images, phone numbers, email addresses, and their social media profiles. End quote. Now, this group targets regions and industries primarily in the Middle East, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And this is in sectors like energy, telecom, and aviation. There's also evidence of geopolitical context gathering operations to bolster Iran's positions in like proxy wars or nuclear negotiations. This is most of the more current 2024-2025 ops that align with this group. Now, because this group has had their ops burned so many times, and groups like Unit 42 have been tracking them for a while, there's a lot of reporting out there, and some of the interesting, for lack of a better term, TTPs they tend to employ. At least it's interesting to me. One campaign to note is the 2020 novel use of bitmaps and email as a command and control infrastructure used in a telecommunications provider in the Middle East in 2020. Specifically, this campaign's malware was dubbed RDAT because the PDB files for the developer that left it behind indicated that was the name of the payload that they were working on. That's what they called it in their development stages, or at least that's the folder it was in. Now, the use of stenography and email as a command and control channel makes this much more difficult to detect. Luckily, they were PowerShell YOLOing through the network and reaching out to domains as well with PowerShell. So at least according to the semantic report, it wasn't extremely difficult to remediate or detect. But this hasn't been the norm. They've also gotten way better. And that's kind of a core feature of APT34 is kind of defense evasion. Now, key examples of this include evasion and sandbox awareness through malware samples like PowerBat and Shapeshift. These incorporate sandbox detection and obfuscation, and they had signed binaries, so you can't really use antivirus to just alert on anything that's unsigned. Now, as an added bonus, they also disabled firewalls and removed their indicators post-compromise. A step beyond basic living off the land tactics or leaving your crap all over the place. Then there's the heavy reliance on HTTP or port 443 for their C2, and they use DNS tunneling as a fallback and tools like ISMA agent. And this allows them to blend in with legitimate web traffic and evade network filters more efficiently. This isn't that novel, as most threat actors try to stick to network protocols being used in the environment, but it does highlight the goals of long-term persistence and evasion here. Now, the last part of this is where modular backdoors and custom stuff they like to write, especially into 2023 and 2025. They use .NET-based backdoors for native APIs for execution. They've added exfiltration modules as well and detection evasion code. And this is all in a way to adapt quickly to endpoint protections being rolled out. Now, this shows a sign of maturity in payload development, or at least they have a 10x developer. They can switch up these payloads so it's difficult to fingerprint and detect. And since you're using native APIs and signed code, this forces you to start looking at behaviors for detection more than other indicators that may be easier to alert on. For example, why does this binary communicate on full port 3? What is this domain? Why does it do all its actions at night? Why does this binary have child processes as PowerShell? These are some of the questions you probably need to ask yourself if you're doing triage for these types of events. Now, obviously, having this type of telemetry is important. Some would say crucial for detection as well, but let's start wrapping this show up, as I think we all get the point here. I wanted to compile this episode as most threat intelligence firms, organizations, content creators, etc., they tend to focus on some of the bigger players out there, China, Russia, and even North Korea, which is obviously warranted, especially when you're shelling every SharePoint or Exchange server on the internet, turning off power to a country you invaded, or plundering every cryptocurrency exchange managed by idiots who think it's a good idea to have the ability to transfer millions or billions of dollars through the use of a phone near instantly. However, with current events spotlighting Iran, I think it would be useful to give an introduction to the threat actors involved and the historical context for the modern day geopolitics. They all kind of tie together. Because sometimes I think it makes sense to take a step back and look at the broader picture of these groups and why they do things. And while all these groups may sound impressive or give the illusion that it's impossible to stop a state-backed, motivated adversary, it's important to remember these are people too, and people make dumb mistakes. Like APT35 leaving training videos open to the internet so people could just copy their TTPs to attack and fingerprint them, or just watch them attack victims through the use of a video file. And not to mention all the other intel gathered on the group that hasn't been released, like the Forrest Gump of Iranian attacks, Bab Duqatan, the adversary that seems to always be in the right place at the right time, has plenty of dumps on various groups. Now, back to the logic behind this episode. I think history tends to be taught in chunks that are advantageous to the narrative being told. Perhaps I'm even guilty of that here. But it reminds me a lot of the old Norm Macdonald joke, where he points out that it's awesome that throughout history, only the good guys have ever won every war. Now, obviously, there's a tendency to paint people in overly simplistic colors while thinking that history is linear. The reality is that most people have motivations for their actions, and history is often more like a web than a straight line. When one point of the web is interacted with, other points wiggle. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little. I think that needs to be a takeaway here. No one is trying to say Iran is the good guy, or their attacks are justified, or by having a proxy network of terrorists is a great idea. It's the old narrative of they hate us for our freedom, or they're just bad people. That's rather weak. I mean, if the roles were reversed, you might not get to the same outcome as someone else, but it's likely that you can see how they got there. And once again, at the risk of sounding like an apologist for Iran, I'm not advocating for them or their interests. I'm merely trying to give some of the context I think about when applying it through reasoning models on their motivations or threat act. Knowing why someone would do something gives you an idea of who is doing it. That old motive thing might be something to it after all. And for the record, I think death to Israel and death to the United States is a stupid slogan and something awful to wrap your cause around. And I get it. It's easy to see the immorality of practices found outside one's culture, time, and place, long after the judgment about them has changed in the attitudes of the public, or where you risk nothing by pointing them out. And I ask that you try to remember that, especially when you're thinking about everything that deals with other human beings. Also, I think this is a good place to end. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, and all the other things you do on social media. And if you hated it, Please do all of that, but leave out any of the complaints. I would really appreciate it. I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.
Crank